The Passage to Hysteria. Part 1. Passage to Hysteria. Written by Joseph D. Stoddard. The inconceivable horror. Deep in the eerie and endless chasm of space exists an entity of truly inconceivable horror. An eternal evil, whose existence was the institution of all suffering. All of the turmoil and agony that has ever been or ever will be, could trace their lineage to this dark celestial spectre. An abhorrent phantom, it feeds from the torment of all living organisms. Every shattered bone, broken heart and tortured soul has filled the ever-empty void of this amalgamation of all terror. It travels across galaxies, in search of living souls to reap. For it salivates at the thought of your anguish, and it yearns for your suffering. For all of time, it has lurked in the deep dark crevices of space. Nameless, some say this haunting presence has always been, and always will be. Lifeless and formless, its true nature is utterly incapable of being understood. Like it is our instinct to breath, its nature is to seek and create misery. As we feed from the nutrients of food, it fuels itself from our afflicted souls. It desires to add every living thing to its awe-inspiring hoard, and drape the entire universe in its dark essence. It peers out into the black abyss and searches for new prey. From one galaxy sucked dry of all life to the next, its colossal thirst is never quenched. After an eon of absorbing life across the cosmos, its gaze has found its way onto our world. For many millennia, it has slowly pierced its claws into human society. For with humanity, the vile terror has found a vast reservoir of souls to fuel its fire. Through the guise of all religion, the promise of eternal life, this celestial trickster has deceived the masses into its deviant clutches. Its galactic stare watches us all with great interest. The humble family, including one man in particular who, on the surface, seemed to have nothing extraordinary about him. A truly average man if you had ever seen him. Though as we all know, looks can be very deceiving indeed. Matthew Cooper, a man of small stature and modest origins, resided in a town in the center of New York. His life read like the alphabet, predictable and formulaic. He did what many men did in his time. He met a beautiful girl, whose name was Elizabeth, and fell in love. Their love manifested itself in the form of an angelic child named Anna. Together they populated a heavenly home and coexisted in a cocoon of comfort and safety. Matthew's days were full of arduous labor, and his nights full of cozy family activities. Day in and day out, his life played out like so many others. Though Matthew did not view his life as inadequate, he did not envy the rich and powerful, nor did wish to be anything like them. Mr. Cooper was quite content with his quiet and average existence. As far as he was concerned, so long as his girls were happy, so too was he. Deeply enveloped in the alluring warmth of his family's love and appreciation, Matthew had found peace. Though nothing is truly everlasting, well, almost nothing that is. On a cool autumn afternoon, Matthew patiently awaited for the return of his wife. Elizabeth had departed to pick up their daughter Anna, who had just celebrated her 8th birthday, from school. He leaned back into the leather recliner beside the fireplace. As the sound of crackling wood echoed outward, Matthew gazed upon his home. A simplistic man at heart, Matthew deeply enjoyed a peaceful and still silence. An uninterrupted moment for him to collect himself, and clear his mind of any clutter. He gazed upon the swaying flames beside him, and recollected on he and Elizabeth's wedding day. He remembered how they two swayed in such a free-spirited manner. He appreciated how, despite all the years and obstacles, they had never lost that spark. They somehow managed to maintain a sense of wholeness that they gifted one another. In his younger years, Matthew had always yearned for a sense of purpose. He would wander from one thing to another, hoping to find what he had been missing within. Though, all he would find was a temporary thrill, a fleeting high. Matthew felt lost and directionless. He spent many evenings glaring at the wall, contemplating just how pointless life truly was. His thoughts would drift to dark and dreary places in the wee hours of the night. Sleep would become a distant acquaintance of Matthew's, only sparingly paying him a visit. Deprivation of rest would take its toll on the young man's psyche, and cause him to lash out upon those closest to him. A hermit, Matthew would become, tucked away in his crumbling shell. In his echo chamber, his bitter and pessimistic views would amplify. The deeply wounded boy would soothe his emotional turmoil with poisonous elixirs. The type 1 could find in the dark pits of society, though they would numb Matthew from the pain, his body and mind would begin to rot from their acidic tendencies. After years of abuse, the tormented soul found himself at the peak of one's ability to endure, the end of his rope. The thought of departure was the only thing that brought Matthew a sense of relief, a mere moment of peace. The poor lad frequently fantasized about freeing himself from his dysfunctional vessel. For Matthew in those darkest days, there was no light in sight, nor even a belief in light at all. But the light would shine upon the boy, and banish the dark, in the form of a girl. Her hand pulled Matthew out of a pit he once believed was too deep for anyone to climb out of. She had purified him of the poison, and purged him of the blackness within his soul. All of these years later, Matthew still could not comprehend just how far he had come. The appreciation and devotion he felt towards his sweet Elizabeth was immeasurable. A smile grew upon the hardened man's face, as a single tear cascaded downward. The sound of the front door opening snapped Matthew back to reality. He rapidly wiped the tear from his cheek, and turned his head towards the door. "Daddy!" exclaimed little Anna in the most joyous of tones. The sound of her innocent voice filled Matthew's heart with pure joy. "Anna Banana." As Matthew responded, he eagerly hopped from his recliner and bent down onto one knee. Anna ran into her father's arms, and gifted him with tightest embrace. "I missed you, Daddy. Why can't you come to school with me?" asked Anna, as she gazed up into her father's eyes. The sight of his daughter caused an immovable grin to decorate his face. "I missed you too, sweetheart. And I gotta go to work so I can buy you all of those toys that you love so much." As Matthew conversed with his daughter, his wife Elizabeth entered the room. Anna leaned in and whispered into her father's ear. "Mommy said I could have ice cream, as much as I want." Matthew's eyes widened as he lovingly spoke to his daughter. He looked up at Elizabeth, to see a confirming smile and nod. "Oh, she did, huh? What's the special occasion?" As Matthew asked, Anna's smile faded and her head lowered. Concerned, Matthew consoled his daughter. "I don't want to talk about it, Daddy." Her head maintained its slumped position. Elizabeth chimed in. "We'll talk about it later, Matt, but she had a tough day at school." Matthew held his daughter close, and scooped her up off of her feet. "Anna, you know you can tell me and your mom anything. We are always here for you, no matter what." His words seemed to improve Anna's mood a tad bit, as her head began to raise back up. Matthew added, "You know we would do anything for you, and we will never let anything happen to you, sweetheart." Her cobalt blue eyes linked with her father's, though her frown remained. Matthew was determined to change that. "And if that frown doesn't disappear, I'm gonna have to tickle you." Matthew began to furiously tickle Anna, who burst out into laughter. "Stop it, Daddy. I'm smiling, I'm smiling." Her giggles persisted. Matthew inspected her face for proof of her claim. "That's more like it, cutie." With his daughter still in his arms, Matthew walked over to greet his wife. He leaned in and gave her a brief but wholehearted kiss on her lips, and wrapped his free arm around her. "And how is Mrs. Cooper doing?" asked Matthew, smiling. Elizabeth returned a smile, and rested her head upon his shoulder. "She's good, but tired. In need of a shower." Anna chimed in with a request. "Mommy, can I have ice cream now?" Elizabeth caressed her hand across her daughter's hair and placed a loving kiss on Anna's forehead. Of course you can, sweetheart. But I'd like to talk to Daddy first. So go change out of your school clothes, then it's ice cream time. Matthew placed little Anna back on the ground, and she skipped her way towards her bedroom. As he stood back up, Elizabeth was ready with a hug of her own. She leaned her head upon Matthew's chest. They held one another close in complete silence, swaying back and forth to the song of their joint hearts. She looked up and gave Matthew a long and passionate kiss. "I love you so much, baby," said Elizabeth with nothing but fondness in her face. "I love you too, beautiful, more than you'll ever know," responded Matthew, as he then placed another kiss upon his wife's lips. After a moment of bliss, Elizabeth spoke on the subject of Anna's hard day. "She's been getting bullied again, Matt. The others' kids keep making fun of her birthmark." Elizabeth was referring to a rather unique birthmark that was located on Anna's left cheek since birth. The mark, or scar, had an appearance that would almost suggest an intelligent design behind it. The mark resembled a square, with what appeared to be a circle encompassing it, with several lines protruding outward. Matthew and Elizabeth had specialists inspect the birthmark, and had been informed that it caused no harm to Anna. Matthew shook his head in disappointment. He wished for nothing but a happy and peaceful life for his daughter. Being a victim of childhood bullying himself, Matthew took the issue personally. "I knew that idiot principal of hers wouldn't do anything about it. I'll be giving her a piece of my mind," Matthew exclaimed in irritation. "Matt, there's only so much they can do. Kids are gonna be kids. I don't like it any more than you do, but I think we have to teach her a mature way of dealing with the bullying," Elizabeth responded. Matthew released his embrace upon his wife, and turned towards the fireplace. As he peered into the blaze, he recalled all of the harsh bullying he had gone through as a child. With his back still turned to her, Matthew spoke. "I just want better for her, Liz. I don't want her to have to go through what I went through as a kid." He turned back to face his wife before continuing. "All of that crap, it made me hard inside. It made me turn inward, and push people away. I became introverted because of it, which is what led me to." Matthew paused, and broke eye contact. "Well, you know what?" Elizabeth knew better than anyone all the trauma that Matthew had endured in his earlier years. She approached her husband, and comforted him with a hand placed upon his arm. "Matt, that is not going to happen to her. She's a smart kid, and she's got two parents that love her more than anything. She won't have to turn to herself, because she will have us." Matthew admired his wife more than she could ever understand. Her strength, beauty and eternal optimism inspired him. It compelled him to be a better father and a better husband. As his hands caressed her waist, he spoke to her in a soft and intimate tone. "I don't know what I'd do without you, beautiful." With those words, Matthew planted a long and passionate kiss upon his loving wife's lips. Elizabeth looked up at her husband with a burning love in her eyes. "I don't know what you'd do without me either," said Elizabeth, followed by a shared laughter between the couple. "Come on, we've got a little girl in desperate need of ice cream," said Matthew. The loving family enjoyed a long and peaceful evening of dinner and television. Soon after putting the now very tired Anna to bed, Matthew and Elizabeth decided to go for their nightly walk around the block. The couple dressed warm to combat the chilly October breeze. With jackets, gloves and hats, the duo set out into the dark cold for a nighttime stroll. The neighborhood silent, and the street lights illuminating the black pavement, slow but consistent wind whistled about. Hand in hand, swaying back and forth with each and every step. The longtime lovers walked in the peaceful quiet. "You can really see the stars tonight," remarked Matthew, as he peered up at the endless glowing sky. "It makes you wonder what's out there," he added. Elizabeth joined Matthew in his stargazing. "A whole lot of nothing, or little green men," Elizabeth responded, with a small giggle to follow. They continued their stroll down their long straight road. Matthew noticed that Elizabeth had begun to shiver. You cold baby? Matthew inquired. More like freezing my ass off. Elizabeth responded, then added. It's a lot colder than I expected. Matthew nodded in agreement, as he was a tad caught off guard by just how cold this particular evening was. We can turn back if you want. Matthew offered, not wishing for his wife to have to endure any more of the harsh winds. No, I'm fine, Matt, thank you. Let's finish the block. Matthew smiled, as he admired his wife's fortitude. That's one of the many things that attracted him to Elizabeth when they first met. Being a nurse, Elizabeth was constantly helping others and facing difficult obstacles. Despite her challenging occupation, she always had an aura of positivity. Nothing could shake her, and she never threw in the towel. As the couple reached the end of their street, they rounded the corner. About halfway down the street, on the opposing side that Elizabeth and Matthew were walking, was a small convenience store. This particular store had gained a reputation for attracting the less than desirable types in the neighborhood. As the couple were passing the dimly lit shop, they noticed some sort of ruckus occurring in the alleyway beside it. As they gazed across the street, Matthew and Elizabeth identified two individuals lingering in the alleyway. Both dressed in ragged and worn clothing, and wearing some bizarre type of hat. One was ravaging through the store's dumpster, and not being subtle about it in the slightest, whilst the other seemed to be spray painting something on the side of the building. As they maintained their pace, Matthew leaned over to his wife. This town is starting to go downhill. His remark caused Elizabeth to scoff under his breath and immediately respond. Starting to, it's been for a long time. I've been seeing these types all over the city, all wearing those matching hats. Like some sort of bum club. Her remark caused Matthew to laugh a little louder than he would have preferred. The bizarre men ceased their searching throughout the trash can, and turned their heads towards the passing duo. The taller of the two began to walk forward, emerging from the dim alleyway, and stopped directly beneath the nearest street light. Matthew and Elizabeth noticed this behavior, and their previously light-hearted demeanor quickly morphed into concern. The man did not move a muscle, but simply watched as the parents walked past his gaze. Concerned for their safety, Elizabeth whispered to Matthew, "Why is he staring at us?" Matthew performed a shushing gesture with his finger. "Just keep walking, don't look at him," Matthew stated in with a firm tone. Then, as the couple were just passing the man's direct stare, he began to shout in a foreign tongue. Though the two did not know what he was saying, they could sense anger in the man's shouting demeanor. Matthew and Elizabeth both simultaneously quickened their pace. The other scraggly individual then joined his taller acquaintance beneath the street light. Both of their eyes watched the two with an unsettling expression. As the husband and wife disappeared into the night, the man continued to shout his foreign words at him from afar. Once his words were only a distant echo, the couple finally began to relax their pace. Looking visibly shook, Matthew spoke. "What the hell was that all about?" Elizabeth looked over her shoulder before responding. "I have no idea, drugs can really screw you up. What the hell language was he speaking?" Matthew paused for a moment. "I have no idea. It didn't sound like any language I've ever heard. Maybe we should put a pause on the walks for a little while, babe." Elizabeth shook her head in agreement. "Yeah, that was scary, Matt. What if they came at us?" Matthew could hear the worry in Elizabeth's voice, and was quick to console her. He came to a complete stop, and pulled her close. He held her tight against his chest, and kissed the top of her head. "I will never let anything happen to you, baby, I promise you." He ran his fingers through her long brown hair, and inhaled its pleasant aroma. "They would have to kill me before I let them lay one finger on you, I promise you that," he added with an intense but adamant look in his eyes. She looked up at her man and smiled in comfort. Her hazel eyes managed to shine, even in the cold dark. Matthew could see the reflection of the stars in her pupils, and smiled back before embracing her once more. "Now let's go home, and get you out of this cold beautiful," said Matthew as the couple continued their march towards their residence. "Sounds good to me, handsome," Elizabeth giggled, as their intertwined hands swayed in the cool night air once more. Once back in their home, safe and sound, the couple removed their outside clothing. They then retired to their bedroom for the evening. Once all comfy and tucked away in their bed, the two held one another and enjoyed each other's company. Flipping through the endless channels on the television, Matthew and Elizabeth discussed a larger array of subjects. From hobbies, to Anna's issues at school, to their hopes and dreams for the future. The couple chatted for the next hour or so, while enjoying their favorite programs. As the two began to daze under the warm and soft blankets, they nuzzled one another in sweet comfort. As Matthew yawned, so too did Elizabeth. He leaned his head back onto his pillow, and Elizabeth reached over to turn off the bedside lamp. As her fingers just grasped the lamp's knob, a spine-chilling scream emanated from down the hall. The holler rang out throughout the home, and parents' eyes widened in fear. They could recognize their daughter's voice, and terror filled their veins. Without a word, Matthew threw the blankets off of him, and hopped out of bed, with Elizabeth right behind him. As they raced out of their bedroom and down the hall, another blood-curdling scream rang out. Matthew shouted out to his daughter, "Anna!" Matthew slammed into Anna's slightly ajar bedroom door, and flipped on the light. The parents scanned the room, and felt a great sense of relief when they saw their daughter sitting in her bed. Though young Anna looked absolutely petrified, her arms crossed, clasping one another as she trembled, her eyes wide, and her lips quivering as tears spewed from her eyes. Matthew and Elizabeth rushed to comfort their distressed child. Elizabeth wrapped her arms around Anna, and pulled her close. Matthew, on the other side of the bed, lightly caressed Anna's back. As the young girl continued to sob, her mother tried to console her. "It's okay, sweetheart. Mommy and Daddy are here." Elizabeth's tranquil whisper was very soothing, but failed to calm Anna. Through her weeping, Anna responded, "They were trying to take me away. He had a knife, Mommy." The sound of her child's pain caused Elizabeth's eyes to begin to well up with tears. She kissed Anna's head, as Matthew took a try at comforting his daughter. "It's okay, baby. It was just a nightmare. We all have them." Anna looked at her father, face red and covered in tears. "It wasn't a nightmare, Daddy. They came in through the window." Matthew leaned in and hugged his daughter. As he did this, he briefly glanced over at the window beside her bed, looked away, then looked back. To his absolute horror, Matthew could not believe his eyes, as he saw that Anna's window was wide open. To make things even worse, there was a noticeable footprint on the window sill. Matthew froze with fear before uttering out the words, "Oh my God." Elizabeth grew concerned as she noticed Matthew's demeanor shift. "What it, Matt?" In his state of panic, Matthew could not form any words, and instead pointed his hand at the window. Elizabeth turned her head to look at where her husband was pointing. Her eyes bulged, and her jaw dropped in terror. Her hand covered her mouth a split moment before beginning to scream. The curtain billowed in the air from the powerful wind outside. As his daughter and wife wailed, Matthew stood up and marched over to the window. He stuck his head out of it, and gazed out into the black of the night. He hollered at the top of his lungs, "I will kill you. Do you hear me? Don't ever come back here or I will fucking kill you." Uncontrollable rage filled Matthew's body as he continued to yell out the window, "I will find you and I will kill you." Elizabeth snapped at her husband. "Matt, knock it off. You're terrifying her." Elizabeth's words resonated with Matthew, cutting through his rage. His wife was right. Despite how scary of a situation this was for him as a father, it had to be that much more horrible for Anna. Matthew removed his head from the outside, and closed the window, being sure to secure its locks. He turned around and returned to his daughter's side. He spoke to her. Anna, look at me. Anna did as her father asked. Their eyes locked. Did they touch you? You know where? The father fought back tears, not believing that he actually had to have this kind of conversation with his 8-year-old daughter. Without speaking, Anna simply shook her head no. Matthew sighed in relief, as did Elizabeth. Matthew prepared to ask another question. What did they say to you, sweetheart? A long tense moment of silence fell over the room, before Anna looked at her father and said, They said, it's been waiting for you for a long time. A mixed expression of confusion and fright filled Matthew's face. He looked over at Elizabeth, who looked just as distraught. Matthew lowered his head into his hands, and tried to calm his breathing. It was Elizabeth's turn for a question. Can you tell me exactly what happened, baby? Anna paused for a moment, still sobbing, then looked back at her mother. I woke up and they were standing by the bed. Elizabeth interjected. How many of them were there, Anna? 2. Anna responded. They had knives, and pointed them at me. I screamed, then they left. Elizabeth could see that the questions were making Anna even more upset, and decided to stop. She looked over at Matthew, who already had his cell phone out. He looked back at her. I'll call. With that, Matthew contacted the police. About 10 minutes later, there was a knock at the front door. Matthew welcomed the police officers into his home, and escorted him to his daughter's bedroom. There, Elizabeth continued to hold her daughter in a loving embrace. The police delicately approached the very emotional Anna. One of the officers spoke, whilst the other observed the window. He knelt down beside the young girl's bed and addressed her. Hey Anna, my name's Officer Parker, it's nice to meet you. I wanted to let you know that you are a very brave little girl. Anna looked up at the officer, still trembling. Thank you. Her voice sounded hoarse. Officer Parker smiled at the distraught child. I actually have a daughter about the same age as you. Officer Parker looked around the room, and noticed all of the pink things that populated it. She likes pink too. The officer's comment caused a small and brief smile to appear on Anna's face. Elizabeth smiled as well, as she appreciated Officer Parker's charm. Do you mind if I ask you a couple questions about what happened earlier, Anna? I know it was really scary, but I gotta ask some questions so I can go catch them. Anna reluctantly nodded her head in agreement, whilst looking straight down at the ground. Officer Parker responded. Thank you, Anna. You were very brave. The officer asked Anna what had happened, to which she told him what she had told her parents. Then he asked his next question. Okay, can you tell me what they looked like? I know it was dark, but try your best. Anything you remember will be helpful. Anna thought for a moment. She was noticeably very shaken by the whole experience. After a pause, she responded. One of them was tall, the other was short. They both had hats on. A puzzled look appeared on Matthew's face, as he looked over at Elizabeth. She had a similar expression on her face as well. The police officers asked the traumatized young girl a few more questions, then spoke with the parents privately. Out in the hall, Officer Parker stood with Matthew and Elizabeth. The other officer stayed in the bedroom with Anna. Officer Parker's demeanor changed from light-hearted with Anna, to more serious now. He spoke to Matthew and Elizabeth. Look, I don't want to scare you guys, but we've been having a lot of these types of calls lately in the area. Same story, over and over again. And we've been seeing these guys all over town, wearing the same hats, looking like they're high as a kite. Matthew interjected. Did you say hat? Because we saw 2 guys with matching hats a couple hours ago down by the corner convenience store. The officer seemed intrigued by Matthew's statement. Let me guess, they were tagging the building, weren't they? Matthew nodded, as a growing feeling of uneasiness grew within his stomach. Officer Parker continued. Yeah, it's a serious problem. It seems to be some sort of gang, but not the typical type. These guys are weird, like religious or something. Elizabeth had a few questions for the young officer. Are there a lot of them? Did they come from somewhere else? Officer Parker took a moment before responding. We can't be sure, but it does seem like they do seem to have a lot of followers. And no, we've contacted all of the neighboring towns, and they haven't had anything like this occur. Either it originated here, or they just dropped out of the sky. Officer Parker chuckled, though the parents were in no laughing mood. He continued on. Be sure to check all your windows, make sure they're locked. I would not recommend going out after dark anymore, at least until we get a handle on this. Matthew looked over Officer Parker's shoulder to see his partner taking a photograph of the footprint below the windowsill. The flash of the camera briefly illuminated the room. Matthew returned his attention to Officer Parker. And of course, if anything happens, please call us. Matthew extended his hand out to the police officer. Thank you, sir. We appreciate it more than you know. Matthew and Officer Parker shared a firm handshake. The police officers left the home, taking with them a sense of security. Matthew and Elizabeth brought Anna into their bedroom for the night. Anna and Elizabeth cuddled together under the blankets. The younger girl still trembled from her experience. Before joining his wife and daughter, Matthew visited the bedroom closet. It was a long closet, about 10 feet deep, located only 5 feet from the couple's bed. Matthew walked all the way to the back of it, and retrieved a box tucked away shoebox on the highest shelf. He removed the lid of the box, to reveal a handgun. Matthew inspected the firearm, and confirmed that it was in fact loaded. He returned the handgun to the box, and placed the lid back on top. But instead of returning the box to the top shelf, he instead placed it at the entrance of the closet. Elizabeth called to her husband, who had spent a noticeable amount of time in the closet. Honey, come to bed, please. Matthew did as his wife asked of him. The family snuggled in close to one another, and held each other tight. The lights went off, but their minds stayed on. None of them enjoyed any similarity of a good night's rest. Instead, Anna and Elizabeth constantly woke up in the night, whilst Matthew did not sleep a single wink. His eyes and ears engaged and honed in on their surroundings. He found solace in the sight of his daughter sleeping in Elizabeth's arms. At peace, her trembling had ceased. The day it all changed. After a daunting night, the sun began to rise. With it, arose a sense of relief in Matthew's chest. He watches as his wife and daughter woke up, with smiles on their faces. As they yawned and stretched, Matthew hugged and kissed them both. As he held them close, he whispered to them, I love you both more than anything, and I will never let anything happen to you. Elizabeth looked into her husband's eyes, and gave him a quick kiss, before speaking. You didn't sleep, did you? Matthew nodded his head no. Elizabeth caressed his cheek with her hand, then added, Anna, sweetheart, wanna go brush your teeth, then we'll make you some breakfast. Anna was still waking up, and she rubbed her eyes. She responded, Okay, Mommy. The 8-year-old climbed out her parents' bed, and headed for the bathroom. Elizabeth looked back at Matthew. Maybe you should call in today, get some rest. Matthew didn't entertain the idea for a second, and began to shake his head. No, Liz, I'm not calling in. We've got bills to pay, and besides, I refuse to let this affect how we live our lives. I'm not gonna live in fear because of some junky wackos. I'll get sleep tonight after work. Elizabeth's face had an expression of disappointment, but not surprise. She knew her husband, and how stubborn he could be, though she kind of loved that about him. His unwavering commitment to things. He stuck to his word, and she admired those characteristics in Matthew. Okay. That was all she said, before giving him a much longer and more passionate kiss on the lips. The couple got out of bed, and fixed their daughter, and themselves, a healthy breakfast. They all gathered around the dining table, to eat together. It was decided that Anna would stay home from school today, to have a relaxing day with her mother. Matthew and Elizabeth thought that would be best for their daughter. Matthew spoke on the subject. You can have as much ice cream as you want today, baby girl. Watch cartoons, draw, whatever you want. Just have an amazing day, okay? Can you do that for me?" Anna smiled at her father and nudged her head yes. Matthew returned the smile and spoke. "Thank you, sweetheart." With those words, he blew a kiss to Anna. She blew one back to her father. After breakfast had concluded, Matthew showered and got dressed for work. As he tied his shoes, Anna approached her father, with a piece of paper in her hand. "Daddy, I drew this for you." Matthew looked up from his shoes to see his beautiful daughter, with her hand extended out towards him. He took the piece of paper from her hands to view it. The drawing depicted a man, woman and a little girl on a beach. They were hugging one another, and had huge smiles on their faces. Matthew felt so proud of her daughter, and was genuinely impressed by her drawing abilities at such a young age. "Oh, this is beautiful, sweetheart. You are so talented." "Thank you, Daddy." Anna smiled with innocence. As he complimented his daughter's drawing, Matthew's eyes drifted towards the background of the picture. Behind the family was a dark red sky. In the center of the sky was a black circle. Matthew was puzzled by this, and inquired for an explanation. "Anna, why is the sky red though?" Matthew looked at her daughter, who just stared blankly at him for an abnormal amount of time. Then she responded, "That's how it looked in the dream, Daddy." Matthew inquired further, "Oh, so this was a dream you had, was it last night?" Anna shook her head yes, with her hands clasped behind her. "And what is this black circle in the sky, honey?" Anna looked lost once again for an oddly long amount of time, before speaking. "Oh, that's the talking hole in the sky." Her response puzzled Matthew, and he paused before responding. "So this hole in the sky talks?" Again Anna simply nodded her head. "And what did it say?" The little girl looked down at the ground, as if she were avoiding the question. Matthew pressed on. "Anna, what did it say?" She looked up at her father, with a noticeably nervous look on her face. Her eyes chaotically shifted about the room, looking everywhere except at her father. Matthew leaned in, and placed his hands on Anna's shoulders. "Sweetheart, it's okay, it was just a dream, you can tell me." Anna's eyes focused on Matthew. She answered his question. It said, "I found you." A sense of concern washed over the father, as he worried for his daughter's well-being, though he did not want her to pick up on his anxiety. "Well, it was just a dream, Anna. I have weird ones too." He shared a smile with his daughter, before standing up. Matthew leaned down, and planted a kiss on the top of Anna's head. "I love you so very, very much, Anna Banana. And I hope you have the best day ever with Mommy. I'll see you after work." As he began to step away, Anna wrapped herself around her father's legs. He looked down at her, and she looked up at him. A distressed look in her eyes. "I don't want you to go, Daddy, please stay. In case they come back." Tears began to collect in young Anna's eyes. Matthew instantly squatted down, and held his daughter in his arms. "Anna, they're not gonna come back, I promise. Because they know your dad will kick their butts if they do." Matthew's remark caused Anna to giggle. "Besides, if I don't go to work, then I can't buy you any more of those toys you love so much." The little girl uncontrollably smiled. "Okay, Daddy, you can go to work." Matthew laughed with his daughter. Before letting go, he gave his daughter one last kiss on the forehead. As he walked away, he looked back at Anna. "I'll have a surprise for you when I get home tonight." Anna's face lit up with excitement. Matthew looked at the front door, and saw Elizabeth standing there. She held his lunch pail in her hand, which he frequently forgot. She had a knowing smirk on her face, and he nodded his head, letting her know he had in fact forgotten it once again. She handed him the lunch pail, and he thanked his wife. "I don't know what I'd do without you, beautiful." He leaned in to give her a hug. She responded, "You'd live happily ever after, Throw a party maybe. They both laughed, before sharing a passionate kiss. As their lips departed, he paused and spoke to her. No, you're my everything. I am so lucky to have you. Thank you for being in my life. She grinned back at her husband and spoke. Thanks for being in mine, handsome. Matthew reluctantly let go of his wife, and opened the front door. Before shutting it, he looked back. Anna waved at her father, and Elizabeth blew him a kiss. Matthew had one last thing to say before leaving. I love you guys, you're my whole world. With that he shut the door, hopped into his car and drove to work. As Matthew pulled into his parking spot outside of his place of employment, he sat still in his seat. His mind began to race about last night, and he realized that the lack of sleep was beginning to affect him. He retrieved his wallet from his front pocket, and opened it. Inside of its center spot was a picture of Matthew, Elizabeth and Anna. The picture was taken the previous year's Christmas. Matthew gazed at the photo, and was shocked to see just how much Anna had grown in just 1 year. He looked at his wife, and couldn't believe that a woman as beautiful as her fell for a guy like him. Matthew felt truly blessed and grateful for the amazing life and family that he had. He also gave himself a bit of credit for coming a very long way. He had dug himself out of the pits of hell, with help from Elizabeth, and formed the life he had today. Matthew kissed the photo, then returned it to his wallet. With that, he left his vehicle and proceeded to start his shift. Throughout his shift, Matthew felt the sleep deprivation affect his ability to work. Hour after hour, the fogginess grew within his mind. He began to struggle to function and complete his tasks correctly. Despite the drowsiness taking its toll, Matthew managed to make it to his lunch break. He returned to his car to enjoy the lunch that his wife had prepared for him this morning. After turning on the radio, Matthew opened up his lunch pal. He removed his sandwich and a bag of potato chips. Before eating, Matthew felt the urge to thank Elizabeth for putting the effort forward to make him his lunch. He reached into his pocket and retrieved his cell phone. As Matthew turned on his cell phone, he was surprised to see a missed call from Elizabeth. That struck him as odd, because Elizabeth never called Matthew while he was at work. His immediate assumption was that it must be something important, and attempted to call her back. To Matthew's surprise, however, Elizabeth did not answer the call. This was also odd to him, as she always answered his calls. Matthew was also puzzled as to why she would not simply text him. A great sense of concern began to grow in Matthew's chest, and his breathing began to shorten. Thoughts began to race through the man's head, but he attempted to calm himself down. Matthew forced himself to think rationally. You're not thinking rationally, you need rest. He thought to himself. They are fine, he added. Despite his pep talk, the deep concern consisted. Matthew decided that it would be best to quickly go home and check on his wife and daughter. He scoffed, for he believed that this was a bit silly, though it would give him peace of mind, and not bother him for the rest of his shift. Matthew casually started his car, and exited his work's driveway. On his way back to his home, Matthew had many thoughts. He wondered if Elizabeth would find it strange, since Matthew never came home during his lunch break. He did this because his lunch break was only half an hour long. Despite that possibility, Matthew continued to drive home. As he sat at a red light, Matthew's palms began to sweat, and his heart began to race. However irrational it all seemed, he felt a desperate need to see his girls. Block after block, Matthew grew more and more impatient. The drive from his work to his home usually took Matthew about 10 minutes. Though on this day, it felt like an endless drive. As he neared his home, Matthew realized that he would be passing the convenience store on the corner. He was curious to see what those two hoodlums had spray painted on the building. He felt pity for the store owner, and wished that his town hadn't fallen into such disarray. As Matthew approached the store, he began to slow down so that he could get a good look at the vandalism. The side of the building and alleyway came into view, and Matthew searched for the paint. Once his eyes found it, Matthew slammed on the brakes. The car jolted to a complete stop, which jerked Matthew forward. His mouth hung open, and his eyes nearly bulged out from their sockets. His mind could not process what his eyes were seeing. The image that the hoodlums had spray painted on the side of the store was the birthmark located on Anna's cheek. Matthew froze in place, as his breathing became heavy and fast. His mind began to race, then the sound of a honk from behind him brought him back to reality. He stuck his hand out of the driver's side window and waved to the car behind him, before driving off. Matthew significantly increased his speed, well over the neighborhood's limit. His street was upcoming, and Matthew felt a small but invited sense of relief. This feeling was very temporary, however, and was swiftly replaced with a debilitating sense of dread. As Matthew turned onto his street, his eyes were filled with the flashing lights of police cars and paramedics. To Matthew's horror, these emergency vehicles were parked directly in front of his home. Panic overwhelmed the husband and father, as her parked beside the curb. The scene before him showed two police officers speaking on the sidewalk in front of Matthew's home. His front door was wide open, and there was no sign of Elizabeth or Anna. Matthew hopped out of his car and sprinted for his front door. As he did this, the two police officers took notice and pursued him. One of the officers shouted to Matthew, "Sir, you can't go in there." But Matthew did not acknowledge his words, and continued towards the door. About 5 feet from the wide open door, Matthew was halted by the officers. They attempted to wrestle him away from the entrance, but Matthew fought with them. He pleaded to the uniformed men. "Please, I need to see my wife and daughter. I need to know they're okay." Tears began to fill Matthew's eyes. The two officers loosened their hold on Matthew, but did not release him. The one officer turned the distressed man towards him, before speaking. "Sir, you don't want to go in there. I'm sorry, but..." Matthew interjected, screaming at him. No, get the fuck off of me. Where are they?" Matthew pushed the officer away from him, before storming into his home. In a manic state, Matthew walked into the living room, looking all about for his family. "Liz, Anna!" He shouted at the top of his lungs, desperate to see his family. He saw nothing and continued his search. He stormed past the kitchen, towards the staircase. As began his ascent to the second floor, he hollered once more. "Liz, please be okay. Anna!" The father flew up the steps, and darted down the hallway. A growing swell of anxiety grew with him, as he tried to ignore the obvious. As he neared his daughter's bedroom, Matthew plowed into the door with his shoulder. As he entered the room, he yelled once more, "Anna, where are you guys?" His eyes scanned the room, but to the man's dismay, it was devoid of any life. He turned to leave the room, but was shocked to find Officer Parker from the previous night standing in front of him. Matthew was noticeably surprised by this, and instinctively took an aggressive stance. The young officer put his hands up in a de-escalating gesture before speaking to Matthew. "Hey Matthew, it's me, Officer Parker, take it easy, okay?" Matthew stood motionless, his eyes locked with the officer. With a mixed expression of anger and fear, Matthew spoke. "Where are they?" Officer Parker hesitated and noticeably did not want to say what he knew. Matthew's patience had worn thin, and he exploded. "Where is my fucking family?" Again the young officer, looking completely overwhelmed, said nothing. Matthew had reached the end of his restraint, and physically shoved Officer Parker out of his way. "Get the fuck out of my way," shouted the panicked father. As Matthew approached his bedroom door, Officer Parker pleaded with him. "Matt, wait. You do not want to go in there. Please, you will regret it. No man should have to see that." Without turning around, Matthew began to weep and bowed his head down. He spoke through the pain. "I need to see my family." With those words, Matthew grasped the doorknob and slowly turned it. He breathed in deep, before pushing the door open. It swung open, and what Matthew saw brought the man to his knees instantly. He screamed at the very top of his lungs, and manically pulled at his hair. "Ah, no!" The father slammed his fists into the carpeted floor, before hiding his face into his hands. The man hysterically whimpered, as his psyche began to break. His eyes refused to believe what they say. In the center of the bedroom, in front of his bed, laid Matthew's wife Elizabeth. Her lifeless body riddled with stab wounds, and consumed by blood. The realization of such a violent act done to his wife drove Matthew to instant rage. He continued to bellow in agony, and slam his fists into the floor beneath him. After several minutes of this, Matthew crawled over to his wife's ravaged body. As his fingers contacted her skin, Matthew whimpered. He begged for Elizabeth to move, for her life to return. This seemed so impossible to him, and the horror of looking upon his dead wife began to set in. He took her hand and held it in his, caressing it with his other hand. He looked up and pleaded to nothing. "Please, don't do this to me. You can't do this to me." His begging and wishes went unanswered. Matthew looked back down at his deceased wife, and gazed into her hazel eyes. The realization that he would never hear her voice again, caused him to feel a truly indescribable sensation. All of their beautiful moments they shared flashed through his mind. The moment he met her, and the day they moved in together. The afternoon they got married, and the morning she told him that she was pregnant. The night they had Anna, and the years of happiness they shared together. The home and the family they had built, together. Every laugh, and every kiss they had shared. The long car rides, hand in hand, and the walks through the wilderness. Holding one another so close, as they faded into sleep, every single night. Waking up, still holding one another, so grateful to have each other and being so grateful to be alive. Matthew gracefully tucked his arm behind Elizabeth's head and pulled her up. He held her close and gazed down at her. He spoke to her. "I'm so sorry. I should have been here. I should have listened to you." His nostrils flared, as he breathed. "I was supposed to protect you. I am so sorry, baby." His tears cascaded down, and splashed onto Elizabeth's corpse. Her soul had departed, and Matthew now held merely an empty vessel. Despite the overwhelming grief that he was experiencing, Matthew had a moment of clarity just long enough to remember his daughter. His head snapped towards the door, and he shouted, "Parker, come here, please." A moment of silence passed, then Matthew heard the sound of reluctant footsteps approaching. Officer Parker peeked his head into the room. He did not speak, but instead waited for Matthew to speak. Matthew, still holding his deceased wife, asked the officer a question. "Where is my daughter?" His voice was extremely pitiful, as if he were begging Officer Parker to give him good news. Instead, he looked down at the ground, and sighed before answering Matthew. "We don't know where she is. We suspect that whoever committed this atrocious crime, kidnapped your daughter." Matthew began to weep once more, as he lowered his head into Elizabeth's chest. Officer Parker added to his statement. "Matthew, Mr. Cooper, I am so sorry for your loss. But I give you my word, that our department will do everything in its power to return Anna to you safely. Her safety is our #1 priority." Matthew cut the officer off with a scream, engulfed in rage. "It's your fucking job. It's your job to keep the people in this town safe. You didn't do your job, and now my wife is dead. And my daughter is missing." Matthew paused for a moment, and Parker took the chance to interject. "Mr. Cooper, I can't imagine how hard this must be for you." Matthew cut off the cop once again with the same furiosity as before. "No, you can't. You can stand there and give me your spiel about how much you care, and give me your empty promises." Matthew choked back tears, and kept his fierce expression locked. "But at the end of your shift, you'll take off your uniform, and you'll go home to your family. You'll kiss your wife, and you'll hug your kids. And you will forget all about my family being destroyed. Matthew stared at the frightened-looking Parker for what felt like forever. Officer Parker had never seen such an expression on a man's face before. In that moment he realized just how broken Matthew was. He thought of his children and his wife. Just the mere thought of something that terrible happening to them caused the young man to become choked up. Finally, Matthew broke the silence. Now I know it's your job to do everything by the book. But in this moment, you are not a cop and I am not a civilian. We are two men, two fathers. And when I ask you this next question, I want you to answer it, not as a cop, but as a father. Matthew paused, and waited for Parker to acknowledge his statement. Officer Parker seemed hesitant for a moment, then nodded his head with a sigh. Matthew continued with his question. Now, is there anything useful that you can tell me? Anything that can help me find my little girl? Matthew's attempt to stay strong in front of the cop had failed, as his lip began to tremble, and tears flooded from his face. His strong facade had crumbled, and before the officer was an utterly defeated man. A man desperate to save what remained of his family. Officer Parker spoke softly. I've got something. With those words, the officer departed from the room. After a moment, he returned holding something in his hand. He looked at Matthew, and sighed before revealing what he had found. We found this in your living room. Officer Parker held up a large clear plastic bag. Inside of the bag was a bizarre-looking hat. The very same hat that Matthew and Elizabeth had seen atop the heads of the two hoodlums the other night. Now in the daylight, Matthew could make out the details of the hat much more clearly. In the center of the hat was a very familiar symbol to Matthew. For it was the very same symbol he had seen just minutes earlier, spray-painted on the side of the convenience store. It was the very same symbol as the birthmark located on his daughter's cheek. Matthew felt as if he were going insane in this moment. He could not understand what was happening, and what the significance of this symbol was. He looked at Officer Parker with a look of utter confusion. What the hell does this all mean? What the fuck is that symbol? And what do these sick people want with my daughter? Matthew began to tremble with rage, as he was completely buried in gloom. Officer Parker answered the poor man. I don't know, Matthew, I wish I did. These are some sick people we're dealing with. But I can tell you something that will be useful to you. Matthew looked up at the man with a small glimmer of hope in his eyes, and waited for the officer to continue. This is completely off the record, do you understand? Matthew shook his head in agreement. Officer Parker continued. We have figured out that these people seem to congregate at the old dock on the east side of town. In a large worn-down wooden building, we've tailed them back to this location. Now Matthew, I am not telling you to go there, understood? As a matter of fact, I didn't tell you that, capiche? Matthew nodded. Before he could speak, Officer Parker continued. These people are dangerous, and clearly they won't hesitate to resort to violence. I only told you because as soon as I turn this hat in, the entire police force will be heading down there. I don't think a holdout situation will end well, and if they have your daughter, I don't want her in the middle of that. So maybe, you'll have a better chance. But if you go there, Matthew, you do it on your own. I will not be responsible for what happens. Matthew breathed in deeply, then looked back at the cop. Thank you, Officer Parker. The young officer responded. Call me Mike. With that he left the room. Matthew looked back at his wife, and admired her beauty for once last time. He resisted the urge to break down, he could do that later. He spoke to her. I have to go, baby. I'm sorry, but Anna needs me. I will get our daughter back safe, I promise you. With those words, he leaned down and kissed his wife for the final time. Matthew gently hoisted his wife up off of the ground, and placed her in their bed. He put their comforter over her, and tucked her in. He looked at her, and for a moment, pretended that she was simply sleeping. He reminisced about the times he would come home to find her napping in the very same bed. If only that were so, if only she was sleeping. "You just stay in bed, baby, I'm gonna make this right." Though it was hard, Matthew turned away from his wife. He headed for the closet and flung the door open. The manic father squatted down and retrieved the shoebox by his feet. Ripping it open, Matthew removed the pistol from the box. As he stood up, Matthew tucked the handgun in the back of his jeans and flapped his shirt over its exposed handle. As he headed down the hallway towards his front door, Matthew looked around his home. He realized that this place that his family had enjoyed life in would never be the same again. With his wife's passing, also went the joy of this place. It seemed as if the color had been drained from its walls, and its warm glow had grown cold and bitter. Perhaps it was not the home, but Matthew himself. The father paused at the front door and turned around to look at his home one last time, knowing that he may never see it again. With that he departed through the front door. As he hastily headed for his car, Matthew glanced over at Officer Mike Parker, who was speaking with the other officers. Mike nodded at Matthew, before turning his attention back to his partner. Matthew climbed into his car and slammed the driver's door. As he started the ignition, he looked up to see the EMTs approaching his home with a stretcher and body bag in tow. Matthew left in a hurry, having no desire to see his beloved wife in such a manner. The new era. As the sun set behind him, Matthew drove across town with fierce intensity. As he flew down the streets, the cold, sobering reality of what had happened began to set in. It all felt like a terrible nightmare that he could not awaken from. The sight of his murdered wife burned into his mind, and impossible to ignore. The man sobbed, whilst driving nearly twice the speed limit. The anguish and guilt Matthew felt in this moment was something he would not wish upon his worst of enemies. He began to hyperventilate whilst still driving, as his mind struggled to grieve with his immense loss. Matthew tried to breathe and lower his heart rate, knowing that he would be no good to Anna if he were dead. His daughter needed him, and Matthew knew that her safety would be all the Elizabeth would care about. He promised to bring their daughter home safe, and he would die before breaking that promise. As Matthew neared the docks, he noticed all of the street lights begin to flicker, dim and then return to their full brightness. Over and over, the street lights powered down then powered back up, as if some immense power source were draining them. He had stopped seeing other cars for quite a while, insinuating that this section of the city was quite absent of life. Finally, the old withered building came into Matthew's sight. As he approached the turn, Matthew turned off his headlights before turning down the abandoned road. Matthew did not want to raise any attention, nor alert these individuals of his arrival. It was obvious by the condition that this part of town had been long forgotten and neglected. Matthew was surprised to see this old abandoned building begin to emit a large amount of light from the middle of it. This light, similar to the street lights, seemed to flare up, then back down. Like a chest rising and lowering with each breath, the light seemed to pulse. Matthew pulled up beside the front of the building and put his car in park. As he turned of the ignition, he took a moment to observe the structure. To the right of his car, Matthew noticed a broken window on the ground floor. He decided that would be his best way of access. He surely would not be knocking, and hoping to have a pleasant chat. Matthew inspected his handgun once more, before stepping out of his vehicle. He gently closed his driver's side door, trying not to make any sound. Matthew began to tiptoe across the gravel, towards the shattered window. Careful not to make contact with any of the residual glass, he guided himself through the window. Matthew had no idea what he was walking into. He did not know these people, or what they were capable of, and he did not care one bit. All Matthew knew was that they likely had his daughter, and robbed Elizabeth of her life. He would not go out of his way to murder these men, but would not hesitate if forced. If they got in between him and his daughter, their life was forfeit to him. Once he had gotten both feet inside of the structure, Matthew looked around at his surroundings. It was exceptionally dark, with nothing but the moonlight from outside gifting the room any luminescence. He could make out what appeared to be large objects, likely retired machinery, which had large tarps draped over them. Matthew assumed that the building must have been some sort of factory in decades past. As Matthew took his first few steps, he was greeted by the uninvited sound of creaking floorboards. The entire building was likely floored by old decrepit wood. Step after step and creak after creak, Matthew made his way forward into the darkness. Feeling his way past the machines, he looked and listened for any sign of life. Matthew came across a doorway, leading him out of the large room. Matthew found himself in a long and narrow hallway, which persisted on for what felt like forever. Finally, Matthew reached the end of the hallway, only to be met with two more identical hallways. One led to the left, and the other to the right. Matthew saw nothing but blackness down the left hallway, then turned his head to the right. Way down the right hallway, Matthew could see a glimpse of light. It seemed to be flashing from what could be the bottom of a closed door. With a deep breath, Matthew began his trek down the right leading hallway. As he worked his way down the extensive and claustrophobic hall, Matthew began to hear a sound. It sounded like a large surge of electricity or some sort of power. The sound synced with the breathing pace of the light. With each step, the sound grew louder. As Matthew approached, he actually began to feel a vibration emanating up through the floor of the structure. Matthew's nerves began to grow within him, though he pushed forward despite it. As he closed in on the doorway, the sound and vibration only intensified. Then Matthew was startled by the faint sound of voices. He froze in place, not knowing where these voices originated from. He looked behind him into the black void, and obviously saw nothing. After a moment of complete stillness, Matthew cautiously pushed forward. With each step, Matthew could identify the voices more. They seemed to be chanting in unison. The flashing light and vibrating energy grew with each step. Finally, Matthew reached the door, which was noticeably rusty. The voices had grown incredibly loud now, and Matthew could tell that it was coming from several men. The light shining from the bottom of the door stung his eyes. Matthew gripped the handle of his pistol, and noticed just how sweaty his palms had become. Matthew grasped the rusty handle of the large metal door, and gently began to push it open. The muffled chants turned into a roar as Matthew pushed the door aside. As he peered into the room, Matthew was rendered speechless by what he saw. An enormous room, filled with dozens of cloaked figures, all of which were bowing and chanting in unison. These individuals all wore matching cream-colored tunics, with the all-too-familiar symbol embroidered on the back of it. In the center of the room was some sort of doorway, made of some truly foreign-looking material. From this doorway emanated the shockingly bright red and purple light that Matthew had seen only a preview of. The light flowed from the doorway in an almost intentional way, as if it were conscious of its movement. As it swirled about like a flag in the wind, a haunting hum came from it that almost sounded like a voice. This hum was low and guttural, and caused the walls to shake around the structure. Surrounding the doorway were four pillar-like objects that looked like they were from a different world. They shined and seemed somewhat translucent, similar to the doorway. From these alien-like pillars flowed what looked like a beam of energy that leads straight to the doorway in the center. The four pillars seemed to be powering or feeding this doorway. The dozens of hooded strangers continued their bowing and chanting, which caused the hum to grow in volume and the swirling light act more and more erratic. Matthew could not understand what he was seeing, nor what any of this had to do with him or his daughter. There was only one hooded figure that was not bowing or chanting. This figure wore a tunic different from the others, as it was the same red and purple colors as the dancing beam of light above him. This indiv appeared to be the leader, as they held some bizarre-looking object in their hand. This object resembled a mason jar, and within it was what appeared to be a slowly rotating vortex, with shiny little sparks inside of it. Matthew quietly observed the incredibly bizarre spectacle, not knowing how to approach the situation he had found himself in. As the chanting figures grew and grew in volume, the standing stranger waved the mason jar-like object around, which began to release some sort of mist into the atmosphere. This foggy substance expanded like a cloud, with red and purple plumes filling the room rather quickly. Within moments this mysterious smoke had filled the entire room, and even reached Matthew. As it surrounded him, Matthew could hear what sounded like the faintest of whispers coming from the mist. Not knowing if it was toxic or not, Matthew pulled his shirt collar up and over his nose and mouth. As he breathed through his shirt, Matthew tried to scan the massive room for any sign of his daughter. Though with this fog engulfing the entire room, this proved to be a difficult task. Despite his overwhelmed state of anxiety, rage and melancholy, Matthew had no choice but to wait for something to occur. For several minutes, the figures continued to praise this obscure flowing form of light. They chanted in this foreign tongue that sounded like no language that Matthew had ever heard before. The standing figure paced about the room, gazing out upon the bowing men. Their pale eyes passed in Matthew's direction. Matthew immediately crouched down, concerned that the stranger may have seen him. Though nothing changed, the peculiar ritual carried on as before. Matthew stayed crouched, not wishing to announce his attendance of this ceremonial gathering. Matthew observed the intelligent energy dance in the air above them. It seemed to have some inner soul to it, flowing in its own independent manner and cadence. They swirled in and out of one another, mixing colors and shapes, as if they were having a physical conversation with one another. Then the object in the man's hand began to act erratic, as the shiny lights within it intensified, and began to turn to the very same red and purple shade. The standing figure hollered something foreign, and stomped their foot on the wooden floor. Upon hearing their voice, it became clear that this hooded individual was a female. Then all in sync, the dozens of hooded figures all ceased their chanting, and came to a complete stop. Faces and arms flat on the floor. All sounds fell silent, except for those originating from the flowing light above the doorway. The cloaked woman stood motionless for a moment, looking upon her subjects. Then her silence was broken, as she began a speech in this foreign and bizarre tongue. Though Matthew did not know what she was saying, the sounds he made seemed ancient and sinister in tone. Her body language was aggressive and explosive, as he spoke with his arms flying all about. The woman went on and on, spouting about in this mysterious language. All the while, the light above them seemed to slow down and point in her direction, as if it were giving the woman its attention. The whispers from the mist continued as the leader preached to her pupils. The dozens of men all stayed completely still, with their faces pressed against the hard wooden floor. Their arms and hands were stretched out completely, flat, and their legs folded beneath them. For a moment, Matthew became curious about what the woman was saying, and what this insane spectacle was all about. The only thing Matthew's human mind could even somewhat equate what he saw to, was something in the realm of witchcraft or ritualistic practices. Then he recalled that it did not matter what this was all about. Regardless, these individuals had stolen the most important thing in Matthew's life. His child, that he and his wife had created together out of love. What did matter was finding Anna, and getting her away from these people. Safe and sound, Matthew continued to watch the man give his speech. Then the woman began to gesture her hands towards something off to the side, and out of Matthew's sight from his vantage point. She spoke and moved as if she were preparing to unveil something to the people. Then the tunic-wearing individual began to wave her hand towards herself, as if to say, "Come here." As she did this, Matthew heard the sound of a door slowly opening. This was followed by the sound of distant but approaching footsteps. The clunking sound of steps echoed off of the walls of this grand room. Then a massive figure came into Matthew's field of view, with something over his shoulder. As this hulking man grew closer, Matthew became aware of what he had over his shoulder. Matthew felt a mixed feeling of relief and distress as he identified his daughter Anna draped over this large man's shoulder. Matthew was so relieved to see his daughter alive, but also felt completely flooded with panic, not knowing what they had done to her, or if she was okay. Nor did he have any clue how he would manage to rescue her from this room full of men, who all seemed set on keeping her here. The man approached the center of the room with young Anna still placed upon his huge shoulders. Matthew could hear Anna crying and moaning out for help, though her mouth seemed to be gagged with something. As they came closer, Matthew could identify it as duct tape secured over Anna's mouth. Her hands and feet were also bound by rope. Unimaginable rage filled Matthew's body as he witnessed the cruel treatment of his child with his own eyes. Matthew tried to control his emotions and had to fight the overwhelming urge to begin shooting into the crowd of conspirators. Matthew began to breath, trying to calm himself down. He whispered to himself, "Not yet." He knew that he only had one attempt at this rescue and had to make sure that his timing was impeccable. Matthew decided that he would wait until Anna was as close to him as possible, making their escape as short as can be. Matthew inspected his Glock 42 pistol, which held 6 rounds. Obviously there was far more than 6 individuals in the room, so Matthew would have used them wisely. The large man reached the center of the room and set Anna down directly in front of the eerie doorway. The swirling beam of light above them intensified the moment she was placed in close proximity, as did the lights within the mason jar. The assumed leader of the group then looked down at Anna, who was rested on her knees and looked absolutely petrified. The 8-year-old girl had tears uncontrollably running from her eyes, as the woman simply gazed at her. Then she turned back towards the crouched men and continued her foreign speech. She gestured towards Anna as she spoke, and her tone turned into more of a joyful one. It was as if Anna's arrival pleased her, as an unnerving smile spread across the woman's face which seemed to glow from within the hood of the cloak. She then looked back at the young girl with a prolonged stare that made her feeling incredibly uneasy. She then began to speak to Anna directly, as she lowered herself down to her level. The fear in her face intensified as the woman grew uncomfortably close to her, and continued speaking. She held the mason jar up close to Anna's tear-filled face, and pointed to it. The lights inside of it began to intensely bounce about, as the miniature vortex in the center spun unbelievably quick. Anna's eyes looked at the odd contraption, as her chest rapidly inhaled and exhaled. The sight of his daughter so upset caused Matthew to tear up. He never wanted his child to experience even 1 ounce of pain, and always wished to protect her from the ugliness of the world. In this moment, he felt like a complete failure of a father. He watched on as this female continued to violate his daughter's personal space. Then the devious woman leaned in and whispered something into Anna's ear. Her eyes shifted towards the woman, as did Anna's head as it turned in her direction. It was as if she could understand what the woman had said to her. Then the woman addressed the crowd once more, with what sounded like a posed question to them. Then the leader snapped back towards Anna, and aggressively grabbed a hold of her chin with his open hand. Despite the duct tape covering her mouth, the sound of her sheer terror and cry could easily be heard by Matthew. That was too far for Matthew, and he had seen enough of this bizarre demonstration. He switched off the safety on his handgun, and crept forward. He carefully observed, as the woman stood up with Anna's chin still in her grasp. Though he would love to do it, Matthew could not risk opening fire on this maniacal individual holding his daughter. She was far too close to her for a precise shot, and an attempt at her could jeopardize Anna's safety. However, Matthew felt confident that these people were not the type to compromise. That left Matthew with only the option of violent persuasion. Matthew approached the kneeling crowd, standing mere feet from them. Matthew identified his target and sprung into action. He leapt forward and pressed his handgun to the temple of the nearest hooded figure. Matthew wrapped his other arm around the throat of the individual. He whispered in his ear, "Be quiet, or I will put a bullet through your skull." The man complied, and slowly rose to his feet. Once he was fully standing, Matthew secured his grip around the man's throat. Matthew looked around, and discovered that nobody had noticed him yet, which is exactly how he wanted it. Then Matthew raised his pistol upward towards the ceiling, and fired off a round straight into the air. The atrociously loud bang ringed through everyone's ears, as the sound echoed off of the walls. All at once, all of the crouched figures all sat up and looked at Matthew. At the same time, the leader turned her attention towards the gun-wielding father, with Anna still in her grasp. Matthew looked at all of them with fierce rage in his eyes, as they all looked back at him. He inhaled deep, then addressed the crowd of hooded figures. "Now that I have your attention, give me my daughter, or else your friend here is a goner." The still kneeling individuals all remained still and silent. Then after a moment, the leader began to chuckle loudly. As she laughed, the woman pulled Anna in front of her, with her free hand wrapped around her throat. After her laugh had concluded, she locked eyes with Matthew, a smug grin plastered on her hidden face. Then she spoke to the desperate father. "Mr. Cooper, I assume. Thank you so much for joining us." Matthew was surprised to hear her speak English. Matthew remained silent, as his eyes sporadically shifted between the woman and her subjects, mere feet from him. The woman's hand then slowly rose to the crown of her hood, and slowly removed it, revealing a woman with a shocking complexion and long raven black hair. The most prominent and bizarre characteristic of this woman was the tone of her skin. It was similar to the color of the deceased, sporting a purple tint upon her entire face. Her eyes appeared dead and shriveled, with no discernible pupils to be seen. Resembling a corpse with worn-out and stretched skin, the woman appeared to be quite elderly or possibly just unwell. She smiled so confidently at Matthew, revealing a set of repulsive teeth, likely in such a state due to years of neglect. "It is truly an honor to meet you, sir." Matthew's confusion had now reached what he had considered impossible heights. He wondered how this complete stranger knew his name, and why she was so glad to see him. Anna was noticeably happy to see her father, with tears forming in her eyes. The raven-haired woman spoke on. "I assure you, Mr. Cooper, that there is no need to resort to violence. This is not a call for that, but a call for celebration. This day has been thousands of years in the making. For so long, we have waited for this moment." Matthew interjected, as he grew tired of hearing the miscreant speak. "No more talking. Give me my daughter, or I start shooting," Matthew shouted with the utmost intensity and sincerity in his voice. The woman seemed completely unfazed by Matthew's threat, as her cadence remained calm and composed. Matthew picked up on this and felt that despite having the gun, this individual with his daughter in their grasp still had control of the situation. This caused Matthew's heart rate to raise and his hands to sweat, as the raven-haired woman never broke eye contact. Her pale stare was intense and intimidating, even to a hardened man like Matthew. She then, in his own time, responded to Matthew's request. "With all due respect, Mr. Cooper, Anna here is not your daughter, but the daughter of the universe. You have no right to stop her from fulfilling her destiny. You have no idea just how important Anna is." Matthew's rage grew to a nearly uncontrollable level, as his face reddened and his breathing grew even more erratic. He screamed, "I don't give a shit about what you crackpots think about my daughter. She is not taking part in whatever the fuck this nonsense is. You have 5 seconds to let her go, or I am going to put a bullet in your damn skull." Matthew's words caused the eerily confident woman to break out into hysterical laughter, even more grand than before. All of her subjects joined in of the cackling, and the room filled with a discouraging shift in tone. Matthew felt no sense of control whatsoever. After their chuckling had concluded, the leader breathed in deeply, before addressing Matthew once again. "Mr. Cooper, we both know how that will end. With you dead, and Anna still in our company. We do not want that. Why not join us in the ceremony? You can have a front row seat to the dawn of the new era of man. And it will begin with your beautiful child. You should be happy for her. It is such an honor to be the prophecy child. The woman paused for a moment, then began to approach Matthew with Anna still in front of her. As she closed the gap between him, Matthew felt a small feeling of joy. For this is what he had hoped for. As with Anna closer he could escape easier. Matthew mirrored the woman's movement, and pushed the hooded figure forward. Then when there was only but 10 feet between the two parties, the leader of the hooded folk continued. Besides, I know all too well that you are not the type to inflict violence. No respect intended, Mr. Cooper, but I do not believe you have that kind of animalistic aggression within you. I have seen the type, many of which surround you at this very moment. You are a quiet man, soft-spoken. Just put the gun down and stop this charade. This is happening with, or without your cooperation. You cannot take out all of us. Matthew froze as his eyes showed fear, whilst the leaders only showed power. Matthew swallowed hard, then spoke. I don't have to take out all of you, just the ones that get in my way. Last chance, let her go. A long unwavering stare down between the two parties followed, neither willing to break eye contact. After nearly a minute of uninterrupted silence, the raven-haired individual spoke. Well then, it's your move, Mr. Cooper. Matthew had never been one to wish harm upon another human being. However, the trauma he had suffered earlier on had changed him deep down. To see your soulmate violated so brutally changes a person to their core. With Elizabeth's passing, a part of Matthew died with her, and would never return. Matthew simplified it all in his mind. He knew not who specifically in this crowd of hoods in fact took his wife's life, but they were all equally guilty to Matthew. These people robbed Anna of a mother, and robbed Elizabeth of many happy years of her life. Despite his desire to inflict harm upon him, in the name of vengeance for his wife, they did not allow him any other choice in this moment. So Matthew acted quickly and concisely. He made his move, removing the handgun from the man's temple and pointed it towards the crowd of kneeling spectators. Matthew was astonished by their reaction, as he expected them to react in fear to this. A normal human being would flee at the sight of gun pointed in their direction. Instead, they sat completely still, staring a hole through Matthew, their eyes pale and lifeless. The raven-haired woman could see the confusion on Matthew's face, and offered an explanation. If you are searching for fear, Mr. Cooper, you will not find it here. These men are dedicated to the cause at hand, for it is bigger than their mortal lives. At my command, they will ambush you and disarm you. Perhaps you will be able to fire off a round or two, and you may even kill one of them. It matters not, for they will gladly die for this cause. Matthew's frustrations consumed him, but he decided to take a different approach towards his situation, since an aggressive approach clearly was not working for him. He breathed in slowly, then spoke to his adversary. You know my name. I think it's only fair if I know yours. The woman grinned, as if to say that she was so glad that Matthew had asked. She gleefully responded to the question. We here are all nameless, for we have freed ourselves of our assigned identities, for a much grander title. We are the hands through which our Master accesses the earth. Through us, its will shall be done. Matthew was completely lost for words, as he had no clue what this woman was talking about. Despite this, he tried again. Okay, well, what was your name? The woman scoffed, as if this conversation was beneath her, but charitably obliged Matthew. My mortal name was given to me by a coward of a father, incapable of even protecting his own family. Therefore it matters not. That was before I was chosen to lead the search for the prophecy child. Which brings us to today, the most important day in our history. Matthew hoped that this continued conversation may alleviate the tension of the room, and open these people to a negotiation. Matthew pressed on with his questioning. Well, I've got to call you something. You remind me of my sister-in-law a tad bit, so I'll just call you Abigail. So tell me, what is this prophecy? And what does it have to do with my daughter? As the so-called Abigail was about to respond to Matthew, the sound of distant police sirens became noticeable. Abigail's demeanor instantly shifted to a look of desperation and fear. She turned to her disciples and shouted, "We must hurry, seize him." With Abigail's command, the hooded figures all rose to their feet at once and ran in Matthew's direction. Still holding a figure in his arms, Matthew raised his gun up towards the dozen-plus approaching assailants. He blindly fired as his senses quickly became overwhelmed by the multiple targets. The first round found itself in the shoulder of the nearest hooded individual, its momentum spinning the man around and downward. Matthew instantly fired off a second round at another figure no more than 5 feet away. This shot connected with the throat of the man, causing a red mist of blood to begin spewing outward. It showered Matthew and his kidnapped individual. The man clenched his flooding throat, but bled out within moments on the floor. By the time Matthew had fired off the second round, several of the cloaked men had already begun to ambush him from the rear. Matthew began to turn to his left, but was grabbed hold of from his right not long after. He struggled, attempting to release himself from their grip. As the several men attempted to disarm Matthew and grab hold of the handgun, Matthew managed to fire off one last round. This round connected with a man's chest, who was standing directly in front of the gun's barrel. The hooded assailant flew back, and was dead before he hit the ground. Despite his best efforts, Matthew was quickly overpowered and apprehended. The men all forced him down onto the ground, then commenced to kicking him all together in unison. Endless kicks impacted all around Matthew's body, raining down upon him, causing him to shriek out in terror. "Please, let her go." Matthew pleaded not for his own mercy, but for the mercy of his daughter. He cared not for himself, and only wished that Anna could escape this situation. Despite his plea, then men continued their onslaught. Anna began to whine through the duct tape, being deeply affected by the sight of her father being assaulted before her eyes. Matthew became weak from the relentless assault, not even having the strength to put his hands up in defense. Kick after kick, stomp after stomp, the hooded thugs mercilessly beat the desperate father. The eccentric beam hovering above them began to act erratic, as if this behavior displeased it. Abigail took notice of this and, after nearly a minute of kicking, spoke out to her followers. "That's enough. Bring him to me." The hooded henchmen eagerly obliged their leader and dragged Matthew's beaten body to Abigail. They placed Matthew before her feet, then hovered around the badly beaten man. Matthew trembled as he struggled to breath, his mouth full of blood and his own teeth. His head quivered as he tried with all of his might to simply raise his head up off of the floor. His eyes full of hatred as they locked with Abigail's. She looked down at Matthew with a mixed expression of pity and frustration. She began to lecture the battered and beaten man laying before her. "It did not have to go like this, Mr. Cooper. I graciously offered you to join us, to take part in the foremost event of mankind. This is a new beginning for us all. Instead you try to stop us, to stop your own daughter's destiny. If I had it my way, I would dispose of you, and not let you witness the dawn of a new age. But that is not up to me to decide. Our Master will decide your fate, as it decides all of our fate. It is time." With these words, Abigail turned away from Matthew with Anna still in his grasp. She placed the jar containing the shining lights before the otherworldly doorway. Moments later, the spiraling light above flowed its way downward and merged itself into the jar. Matthew watched in awe as these two ethereal bodies of luminescence danced with one another. Within this jar existed an entire universe of beauty, flying by at the speed of light. Matthew, despite his pain, was absolutely flabbergasted by what he saw. The entirety of space flashed by his withered eyes. Then all became still within the jar, and all turned a menacing red and purple hue. The beam retracted itself from the jar, then leapt back towards the doorway. As it made contact, a swirling vortex or gateway flashed into existence. This truly frightening sight caused Matthew's eyes to widen. The sounds it made terrified the man, with sounds of deep space and whispering piped out of this bizarre portal. Abigail and her followers all stared in amazement at the bright threshold. She addressed the God-smacked crowd. Behold, the passage. Thousands of years have all led to this moment. We are truly blessed to witness this. Even you, Mr. Cooper. Abigail looked down at Matthew with a look of disgust, before shifting her gaze up at the all-knowing beam of light. And what will you have of this apostate master? As Abigail asked her question, the portal began to violently swirl and change shape. Horrific, ambiguous visions flashed across the ethereal canvas, before it eventually settled down. Abigail, seemingly understanding what had just transpired, addressed the light hovering above her head. As you wish, my lord. He shall pass through. With these words, a cold chill of terror passed over Matthew's body. He shouted as the hooded men approached him again. No, no, please, don't do this. It's a mistake. The men had no interest in Matthew's words, as they brutally yanked him up off of the ground. They began to pull Matthew towards the eerie and otherworldly void before them, with his feet dragging behind him. Matthew frantically tried to fight back with the minuscule amount of strength he had left. Though it was of no use, as they easily overpowered the limp man. Matthew's eyes turned away from the approaching vortex, and toward his daughter. He saw the fear in her eyes, and wished to take her pain away. He smiled at his daughter, as tears ran down his cheek. In that moment, Matthew took in every little detail of his daughter's beautiful face. He spoke to her in a weak and calm voice. It's going to be okay, baby. I love you. Matthew watched in disgust, as Abigail reaffirmed her hold on his daughter. The agony in her eyes caused Matthew more pain than any beating ever could. Not knowing what awaited him, Matthew closed his eyes with the last thing he saw being Anna's face. The hooded henchman tossed Matthew head first into the mysterious gateway, which consumed his body whole. Anna shrieked in horror at the sight of her father's departure. Abigail saw the pain in the young child's face, and attempted to comfort her. Placing her bony hand upon Anna's shoulder and kneeling down to her level, she spoke to the frightened child. This is not a time for tears, my child, but a time for joy. You are so very unique, truly one in a trillion. You are so lucky to be the child of the prophecies. Gabriel caressed Anna's cheek, the back of his passing over her birthmark. He looked at it and smiled. I'm sure the other children teased you for your mark, but you have no idea just how beautiful it is. It is the symbol of divinity, my child, the universe's way of saying that you are special. You have an importance greater than almost any other, equal to my own. You are the seed from which the new world will blossom. Anna's face screamed of fear, praying for a way out of her predicament. Protect and serve. Just a few blocks from the abandoned factory, Officer Michael Parker and his partner Officer Pitsley approached the scene with haste. Reports of several shots fired at the abandoned building near the docks got Parker's attention. As a matter of fact, he was waiting for the call after he and Matthew's conversation a few hours prior. Being a small town and facing budget cuts, the area was in short supply when it came to enforcers of the law. Though he had nerves of steel, even Officer Parker was feeling tense about this call. He had several cases of home invaders in the last month, all of which matching a similar description. He also knew that this club or gang was strong in numbers. And after the grueling crime earlier, it was clear that they would not shy away from violence. Officer Parker addressed his partner on what they were about to walk into. "I have no idea what we're about to walk into, Tim, so be ready." Officer Michael Parker was new to the force, but not new to combat, having served in the United States Army. He nodded to his partner and responded, "Gotcha, guns at the ready." Officer Parker pulled into the parking lot of the abandoned factory, pulling up beside Matthew's car. Activating the spotlight on his squad car, Parker scanned the area for any information. He commented on what he saw. That would be Matthew Cooper's car. The guy was crazy enough to go in alone. Officer Pitsley responded, "I get it. I'd do the same thing if it were my kid. Sick sons of bitches." Parker continued to scan the area, then spotted shards of glass on the ground beneath a window. The very same window that Matthew had used to gain access to the building an hour prior. "And that would be how Matthew got in," said Parker, highlighting the spot with his light. He paused for a moment to think through the situation, then decided to play it out by procedure. It was his job, and if things got out of hand, then so be it. "All right, let's roll. Hopefully he's still breathing." With that, the two officers departed their squad car and approached the building. With pistols and flashlights in hand, they crawled their way through the shattered window. They scanned the room with their flashlights, seeing the same cloak machines as Matthew did. As they worked their way through the ground floor, Officer Pitsley commented on the surroundings. "Man, these guys got a 5-star hotel for their meetups, don't they?" He chuckled at his own joke, but Parker did not laugh. "Let's stay alert, Tim. These guys won't hesitate and neither can we." The two continued their descent into the dark and musky building, and eventually reached the long hallway. Hearing the very same sounds, and seeing the lights that Matthew had, the men got very tense. "What the hell is going on here?" asked Tim, who was beginning to feel uneasy. "I have no idea, but we're gonna find out," responded Parker, as he hesitantly pressed forward. Step after step, the men felt the vibrations build up through their feet. The otherworldly sounds filled them with unease as they approached the end of the hallway. "Do you hear that, Parker?" asked Tim. Officer Parker stopped to listen to his surroundings. "Yeah, whispers I think," said Parker, as he flashed his light behind them. Officer Pitsley inquired further, "And what the hell is that vibration coming from? Are they turning on these machines?" Officer Parker shook his head and explained, "That doesn't sound like any machine I've ever seen." As the men stopped before the illuminated door, the sounds and vibrations were almost overwhelming. Not wanting to speak, Officer Parker gestured for Officer Pittlesey to turn off his safety. He obliged, with his pistol in hand and ready to use it. With that, Parker slowly pushed the door open. The two armed officers were baffled by the sight of the room. The flowing beam of light, the dark portal, and the unsettling mist upon the floor overstimulated the men. They both froze in place, taking in everything that they saw. They both crouched down behind a shelf near the entrance to the room. They looked at one another for an explanation, but only saw utter confusion on each other's faces. "What the fuck is going on? What is this, some black magic shit?" exclaimed Officer Pitsley, with a look of shock on his face. Parker had no good explanation, and simply scanned his surroundings. Around the room he saw the several hooded men, two of which laid dead on the floor, surrounded by their own blood. One man held onto his shoulder and looked to be in a great deal of discomfort. Then he spotted the so-called Abigail standing behind Anna, with both of her hands placed upon the young girl's shoulders. Officer Parker commented on his observation. "There she is, little Anna Cooper. No sign of her dad though." Officer Pitsley, who was also looking about, chimed in. "Yeah, looks like he took a couple of the bastards with him, though what the hell is with that woman's skin? It's purple." Parker shook his head in disbelief before speaking. "I have no clue, this is some weird shit. Poor kid, what the hell was I thinking?" Pitsley gave Parker a puzzled look before speaking. "Hey, from one father to another, I get it. What Matthew would care about is that we got his kid outta here safe." Parker shook his head in agreement, then issued a command. "Go ahead and radio in for backup. We are way outnumbered, and way out of our league." Pitsley obliged and contacted headquarters. Meanwhile, Parker tried to work out a game plan, though as soon as Pitsley activated his radio, the wandering light took notice of it, pointing itself towards the entrance to the room, and unleashing a horrid sound. The noise was deafeningly loud, as the high-pitched whine rang through everyone's eardrums. The radio in Pitsley's hand immediately shut off, as if its battery had been drained of all power. Parker and Pitsley both covered their ears, in immense discomfort. "What the hell is that?" asked Pitsley, still shielding his ears. Abigail took notice of the light's announcement, and followed its gaze with her eyes. She whistled to gain the attention of one of his followers. As the hooded henchman approached, Abigail pointed towards the shelves. "I think we may have more visitors, go check it out." The follower obeyed his leader's command, and approached the edge of the room. Parker poked his head up, and noticed the man approaching them. He addressed Pitsley. "Okay, looks like we're going alone on this one, get ready." Pitsley shook his head, with a faint look of concern in his eyes. With pistols at the ready, they prepared for their moment. Then Parker gave the order. "Let's go." With that, the two officers stormed out from behind the shelf, guns raised high. "Everybody, hands up!" yelled Officer Parker, with Pitsley right beside him. The approaching man froze in place. Nobody moved, but they did not raise their hands either. Instead, they waited on their leader to issue their next order. Parker repeated his command. "I said hands up, all of you." Still, the dozen-plus men did not obey the police officer's order. Then from behind her subjects, Abigail spoke. "Gentlemen, your authority and your laws carry no weight here, for we are not citizens of your town, but missionaries with the assignment of procuring this special child in front of me." Pitsley, having no patience for failure to comply, nor what he considered to be utter nonsense, interjected. "Shut your trap, lady, and get your fucking hands up. Now." Parker attempted to alleviate the high tension of the moment. "Look, nobody has to get hurt here, but that little girl is not yours to take. Just let her go and this can go nice and peacefully." A smirk crawled across Abigail's face once more, as she addressed the two gun-wielding gentlemen. "Officers, you are interfering with a power far beyond anything that you can imagine. This day has been thousands of years in the making, and we will not let two trigger-happy inbreds get in our way. So I will give you the same choice I gave Mr. Cooper earlier. Put your guns down, and join us in the rise of the new age. Or, face the consequences, or provoking your new god." Pitsley broke out into laughter in response to Abigail's speech. "So you think of yourself as a god, do you? You wackos are all the same. I'll give you credit though, you put on a good light show." Abigail's stare stood unchallenged, as she stared at the officers like one would peer upon a cockroach. An expression of smug superiority and anger. "Oh, I am not your new god. No, I am the instrument of its influence." Pitsley spoke up once again. "Okay, Muz instrument, "Well then, play me the tune of you putting your hands up." The smile faded from Abigail's look and was replaced with a frown of irritation. For the officer's blatant disobedience displeased her. "I grow tired of this, cease them." Upon her command, Abigail's obedient followers began to descend on the officers. Parker took one last chance to avoid any violence. He screamed at the approaching assailants, "Stop or we will shoot." The hooded missionaries paid no mind to his threat and continued their approach. Parker opened fire, followed shortly by Pitsley. Rounds flew forward, crashing into the dozen-plus men. In the chaotic scene, blood cascaded as men fell, and the deafening ring of gunfire filled the air around them. Round after round, the officers fired upon the aggressors. Despite this, they kept coming with fearless conviction. It quickly became apparent to Parker that the numbers game was not in their favor, and that this situation would turn against them very soon. He shouted to Pitsley, "Turn back." Pitsley obliged, but as he began to turn, his arm was snatched by one of the hooded soldiers. Officer Pitsley did not hesitate to confront his attacker. He swiftly placed his firearm against the cranium of the concealed man and pulled the trigger. The savage collision of flesh and ammunition played out right before Pitsley's eyes as the man's lifeless body crashed upon the floor. With that situation settled, the two men turned to flee from the superior numbers of their adversaries. Unfortunately for them, the massive man that had carried Anna into the room earlier was standing before them. He stood a whole foot higher than him, and wider than him both combined. The two officers looked at one another, then in unison tackled the colossal obstacle before them. Despite their combined might, the hulking man barely budged from their push. The men both shared a shocked expression, as the vast individual wrapped himself around both of them. Parker and Pitsley struggled to free themselves from his grasp. He began to squeeze them between his massive arms, causing them both to shriek out in agony. Parker painstakingly wedged his firearm up against the rib cage of the enormous attacker. Without hesitation, he fired upon him. The monstrous individual hollered in horror as he released the police officers. Parker and Pitsley began to run, but were both grabbed by several of the obscured aggressors. Being out of ammunition, Pitsley resorted to striking the men with his pistol. The metal weapon smashed into the nose of the aggressor, which resulted in a splash of blood painting the gun. Parker fired off his remaining rounds, but was soon overwhelmed by the mass of his enemies. Soon the two cops found themselves in a similar position that Matthew had found himself in just an hour prior. An endless slew of kicks and punches rained down on them. Despite their attempts to defend their bodies, the dozens of swinging legs and fists managed to connect with every inch of their anatomy. Abigail watched on, growing very tired of these interruptions. She desired to wrap this up soon, and called out to her subjects, "Bring them to me, quickly." The helpless men were dragged to Abigail's feet. The diseased woman looked up to her luminescent lord, seeking guidance. "My lord, what would you have done with these two?" Instead of pointing towards the dark vortex like earlier, the beam of light turned a menacing red color and released an awe-inspiring roar out into the world. Abigail, with a surprised expression on her face, obeyed its will. "As you wish, my lord. Well, it seems you two will not be as fortunate as Mr. Cooper was earlier." Parker, with a swollen eye and busted lip, looked up at the ominous figure and spoke. "Just let the girl go, she's only a child." Abigail did not acknowledge his words, and proceeded past them. She signaled to one of his henchmen to approach. The hooded figure happily handed Abigail the handgun that Officer Parker had previously wielded. She observed the firearm and scowled at its design. "I find guns to be so uncivilized. We won't be seeing any of these where we're going." Officer Pitsley painfully worked his way up to his knees and addressed the crowd of his adversaries with pride in his voice. You enjoy this moment while you can, you fucking sickos, 'cause in about 5 minutes, every cop in the county is gonna be up your fucking ass. Abigail snickered at Pitsley's words as she approached him, gun in hand. She stopped when standing directly in front of the kneeling officer. The prideful leader looked down at him like a worm on the sidewalk. Pitsley refused to show fear, and instead decided to spit a thick wad of blood, which landed on Abigail's chin. Pitsley grinned, with blood staining his teeth. Abigail did not grimace but instead smiled right back at him, and pressed the pistol against Officer Pitsley's forehead. Pitsley leaned his weight into the handgun, and spoke to his enemy, peering deep into her soulless eyes. "What are you waiting for?" Abigail pulled the trigger, sending a bullet that rapidly exploded into Officer Pitsley's cranium. Smoke spewed outward from the pistol. The rebellious man's head violently whipped back, before his entire body crumbled to the ground behind him. Parker stared in disbelief as he witnessed his partner being murdered right next to him. A look of shock filled his face as he looked down at Tim Pitsley's lifeless body. Parker thought of Pitsley's wife and 2 boys that he had met this previous summer. Memories of grilling and enjoying a warm June afternoon together flashed through the traumatized man's mind. He shook his head in anguished defeat, knowing that he would share the same fate in just a few moments. Abigail spoke to her gang of followers. "Let this be a message to the world. If you stand in the way of destiny, you will be dealt with, swiftly." As Abigail rambled on, Parker looked up to see little Anna kneeling about 5 feet in front of him to the left. With tears in her eyes, she looked at Officer Parker, then looked over at the imposing swirling portal beside her. He looked at her with a confused expression, and Anna responded by nodding her head in a yes gesture. Meanwhile, Abigail rambled on pridefully with Parker out of sight. "We are the police of this brave new world. These government-appointed thugs will be the first of our targets. For once we remove the protection and disarm the population, they will finally see the truth. Either willingly or by force. Our fate will not be denied." Parker looked over at Abigail, who at the moment was not paying any attention to him. Then he looked back at the passageway. He sprung up onto his feet with what little power he had left. He fought through the agony of his beaten body and sprinted towards the gateway. The several remaining figures took notice of this, as did Abigail. She quickly spun around and began to point the handgun towards the fleeing Parker. Though by the time she had the officer in her sights, Parker leapt through the gateway with all of his might. Abigail watched as the injured man disappeared into the void. The prideful leader gave a look of deep anger, as she shook her head in disapproval. The menacing red beam of light roared once more above them. Abigail spoke to it. "My apologies, my lord, I let my guard down. No matter, allow us to carry on with the task at hand. It is time to ascend, to depart from this wretched world." "My lord, if you will." The flowing light slowly transcended from its dark red color to its original blend of red and purple. Then it once again flowed its way downward and into the dark void. As the 2 forces made contact, the entire building began to shake violently. The hooded henchmen all steadied themselves, as Abigail looked on with great interest. The gateway slowly morphed and changed once more. Finally it settled, and came to a still image. Abigail smiled as a tear trickled down her face. "There it is, gentlemen, home." She approached Anna, who whined at the grotesque sight of her. She placed her hands upon her shoulders once more, and smiled down at her, revealing her wretched teeth to the young girl. "Your moment is coming soon, young Anna. The entire world will come to worship at your feet. It is the will of the universe. I am so proud of you, my child." With those words, Abigail gestured towards the colossal henchman. He approached with his heavy steps, and forcefully threw Anna over his shoulder with ease. Abigail led her missionaries into the gateway. After she passed through its eerie edge, so too did the giant man with Anna over his shoulder. Then one by one, the cloaked followers all passed through the void. Then, as the very last of the allies had passed through, the beam of light then retrieved the mason jar-like object. The beam then slowly began to retract itself back towards its source, until it too disappeared without a trace. The other side. "Am I dead?" asked Matthew, who saw nothing but an endless sea of black before him. This place he had now found himself in was completely devoid of anything. No light, no sound, nothing. Matthew had no body, no feeling, as if he had been erased from existence. He pondered what this was. The lack of any sensation was truly bizarre to him. Time itself seemed to have no bearing, as Matthew had no idea just how long he had been, wherever this was. His thoughts began to wind down, and became still. They were the only thing that was in this place, though even they gave into the void. Slowly, they faded and Matthew began to forget himself and everything. His last thought to himself: "Do I exist?" Then nothing, no thought left to delay the inevitable fade into non-existence. So we come from, so we shall return. Black, silent, nothing. Then Matthew found himself violently thrown back into existence, as he discovered his body hurling through a swirling vortex. Matthew was overwhelmed by the impossible velocity in which he was traveling. He tried to find his bearings, but was completely discombobulated from the violent momentum that pushed him forward. His eyes could see what looked like an endless space all around him decorating the edge of the tunnel. Shining stars, cosmic dust of unimaginable beauty and gargantuan planetary structures all passed by his eyes at ludicrous speed. As Matthew cascaded through the dark heavens, the velocity caused him to begin to feel lightheaded. He tried to fight the feeling, but found himself uncontrollably beginning to fade once more. Though this time, his vision was not consumed by an all-conquering black, but illuminated by an all-accepting white. Matthew once again found himself in a complete void once more, only this space was nothing but a bright and all-encompassing white. He thought to himself once again, "The whispers are back, what do they want of me?" He tried to listen to the distant voices, attempting to decode their fleeing words. Though like the sound of a distant car driving away from you, the whispers shrunk in sound, until they disappeared. Matthew had now seen both sides of this coin, and familiarized himself with the nothingness of his surroundings once more. Again, no sight, no sounds, nothing. So we come from, so we shall return. Matthew's eyes slowly opened, to the view of an ever-expanding sky, painted in vibrant reds and purples. The very same colors as the animated and seemingly sentient beam of light he has seen prior. The canvas of the heavens above him was occupied by colossal asteroids floating unnaturally close to the Earth he found himself on. These huge chunks of celestial stone had what appeared to be vines or even veins running all throughout them. They pulsed with some sort of liquid that flowed through the veins. The floating rocks slowly rotated, displaying their beauty and might for Matthew's eyes. Matthew then lowered his view from the skies to the surface he found himself laying on. He discovered that he was laying upon a soft and familiar surface. His fingers ran through what he immediately recognized as blades of grass. What was unfamiliar, however, was the look of this grass. Instead of your typical earthy green, this turf was a glowing neon blue. Matthew's eyes bulged, as he came to the realization that something was very much out of place, and it was him. The disheveled man sat up and gazed at his surroundings. He found himself in some sort of meadow, flush with tall and healthy blue grass. As his eyes followed the grass as it flowed up a gentle hill, they were met with a family of trees all around. These trees had white bark with crimson-red leaves populating its branches. The very same red that shared the star-studded skies with the amethyst purple. These reds and purples of the hovering heavens cascaded their hue down upon the leaves and blades of grass. Matthew found himself astounded by his vivacious new setting. Where the hell am I? Matthew asked himself as he continued to take in the unsettling beauty of his surroundings. He cautiously stood up, and was hit with a strong sense of dizziness. He took a moment to compose himself, then began to timidly walk about. He approached a tree nearest to him, and felt the bark. It felt like any other tree that he had ever touched. Matthew then gave a low-hanging leaf the same treatment, to discover that it did not deviate from your typical leaf in any way except for its color. Though Matthew was surprised to see veins running through the leaf, much like the ones that decorated the asteroids overhead. The silence of this meadow was gently displaced by the sound of a soft wind approaching. The breeze was cool and consoling to Matthew's senses. He breathed in the air, and felt it encompass his lungs. Though there was something quite different about this wind. If one listened to it very closely, they would hear the sound of the faintest of whispers. Almost too quiet to hear, but with the determined effort could be discovered. Matthew looked all around, and saw nothing but endless grass and trees in every direction. The man felt adrift, not knowing what was happening. The last thing he remembered before his light-speed travel was being thrown into that abstract gateway. And before that, gazing into his daughter's eyes one last time. Then the recall of his wife's death filled Matthew's heart and mind with unbearable pain once more. He hung his head, feeling the expanding grief in his chest. Anguish filled every aspect of the man's being, as he asked why such tragedy had to befall his family. They enjoyed their quiet and peaceful existence, and never bothered anyone. All they ever desired was the love of one another, and long happy lives. Matthew felt bitter anger within him, as he felt that the universe was punishing him in some sort of cosmic-level joke. Though Matthew had committed no act befitting such a horrid punishment, Matthew breathed slow, in an attempt to calm his ever-climbing heart rate. He spoke to himself. You promised her, keep that promise. Do not give in to despair. Matthew's head slowly raised, and he began to march forward into the mysterious new world he had found himself in. The lush blue grass and red leaves atop the white trees went on for hours. Matthew felt hopelessly lost as he aimlessly explored the dense shiny meadow in the dead of night. Having no idea on where he was or even where he was going, Matthew decided to simply follow the wind. The faintest of whispers rode along the breeze, as it swayed the blue grass by Matthew's feet. Despite his current situation, Matthew could not help but notice the bizarre beauty of this place. The breeze grew cold, and Matthew zipped up his jacket. As the man continued to stroll around the endless meadow, exhaustion began to persuade him. This place had no moon, and was instead lit by the pulsing asteroids and the infinite amount of stars above. As Matthew looked up, he noticed how the trees nearly blocked out the sky, as they leaned towards one another at the very top. This limited the man's view of the sky. Matthew noticed what appeared to be a beaten path, a sign of people perhaps. Caution fell upon Matthew, as he pondered if it was the best idea to come into contact with others. This land was very strange, and Matthew assumed that its residents, if there were any, would be equally as peculiar. As he stood at the beginning of the path, not sure whether to follow it or not, Matthew heard the sound of rustling bushes behind him. He snapped towards the sound, and was surprised to see what resembled a deer. This animal shared the same anatomical shape of a deer, but had some wildly varied characteristics. Its fur was much thicker than your typical fur and shined a neon yellow, which made the creature impossible to miss. It was clearly a buck since it displayed an impressive rack atop its head. Though this buck's rack black, with blue veins running through it similar to the leaves. Its eyes were as white as paper, and stared straight at the startled man. Matthew did not move, nor did the deer. A long tense draw commenced, as the two simply glared at one another. Matthew awkwardly began to raise his hand in a peaceful gesture. This spooked the animal, and sent it prancing away into the cold night. Before he knew it, the creature had vanished. Matthew decided to follow the path, as he had no other plan of action. The trail was narrow, with lines of trees grouped together on each side of it, no more than 10 feet apart. Matthew marveled at the view above him, as the tiny sliver of sky that he could see truly amazed the senses. The slowly rotating Titan asteroid glistened immaculately. Time passed as Matthew carried on down the winding path. The man had been overtaken by fatigue, as his eyelids gave into the pressure. His head began to bob up and down, as he continued to drag himself forward. Matthew pushed himself onward, as he had no clue what might be lurking out in these woods. If he were to rest, it needed to be in hidden and secluded location. Matthew eventually found such a location, as just off the beaten path was a downward hill. However, a portion of the path protruded over the de-escalation. As Matthew investigated the area, he discovered that section of overhanging path created a comfortable overhead and a cozy spot at the very back. Matthew decided to nestle himself into the space nice and tight. He flapped up the hood of his jacket and tried to pull in all of his body heat. As the night progressed, the temperature regressed. As he got settled into his nook for the night, Matthew's thoughts shifted to his family. His wife and daughter's faces flashed in his mind, and memories of better times played. Matthew prayed that he would never forget the small details of these moments, like the smell of his wife's hair, or the intricate details of his daughter's smile. It pained Matthew that he now only had the memories of his wife, and that his daughter was in the hands of strangers. He wept as the trees and grass swayed all around him. He retrieved his wallet, and took out the family photo of Elizabeth, Anna and himself. He took in every last detail of his wife's face, wishing to never forget it. Matthew gazed at his little girl, and reminisced on all of the magical memories of her childhood. As the man sobbed, the view of his girl's happy faces gave him a minuscule sense of solace. He pressed his lips to the photograph, and returned it to his wallet. Matthew held himself tight, and pretended it was Elizabeth. He closed his eyes, hoping to get some much-needed rest. Only a few hours later, the emotionally and physically drained man was woken up by a familiar rustling sound. As he rubbed his eyes and stretched, Matthew assumed it was the deer again. He climbed out of his cozy spot down the hill, and returned to his feet. He looked about and noticed that it was still night. He slowly climbed up the hill back to the path. As his head popped over the beginning of the path, Matthew was utterly petrified by what he saw. Trudging along the path was no deer, but 3 ominous creatures. These things were absolute abominations to witness. Their anatomy played out in a wild and alien manner. They were hunched with their spines protruding through their skin, which was covered in some ghastly phlegm-like material. This substance oozed off of every inch of their bodies, which was an absolute horror to view. One of the creatures displayed what appeared to be extra limbs all about, with additional hands and arms existing in unnatural places. Teeth, hair, fingers and any other body part you could imagine randomly existed anywhere on these atrocities of life. The beast in the middle was riddled with dozens of bloodshot eyeballs scattered all about like a bad rash. These abominations appeared as if the human anatomy had been scrambled all about, then put back together in an otherworldly abstract way. The 3 creatures moaned in a deeply horrific tone that sounded almost human. They dragged themselves away from Matthew, no more than 10 feet away from him. They were large, an estimated 7 feet high, though their slouched posture made the exact height hard to confirm. Matthew stood motionless, as the things of nightmares passed by right in front of him. The sounds they made were disturbing, terrifying and sad all at the same time. Matthew could not imagine anything more visibly unsettling, as no imagination could create such anatomically unusual beasts. Yet, there they were for Matthew's eyes to behold. Matthew began to quietly and carefully retreat back down the hill and away from those abominations. Though as he went to step down, Matthew's foot slipped, which made a very loud and noticeable sound. Matthew was petrified, as he slowly raised his head, to see if the creatures had heard him. Matthew stood in disbelief, as the three amalgamations of terror had stopped in the track. They were now facing in Matthew's direction. It felt as if their posture was slightly closer to the ground now, and they seemed to be pointed in his direction. The sound of sniffing in the darkness sent a chill down Matthew's spine. Then Matthew watched the three figures lower down onto the ground, like wolves, and slowly begin to prowl back towards him. Matthew struggled to breath, as his heart became spastic. Frozen in terror, Matthew did not know what to do. If he were to stay still, there was no knowing what these things may do to him. However, if he were to run, these beasts, though awkward-looking, may be fast. Regardless, Matthew had very little time to make a decision. As the obtuse beings descended on his position, Matthew's fight or flight demanded a decision. He had decided he would run. Matthew shot up onto the path and sprinted away from the horrid beasts. The disturbing creatures released a ghastly guttural roar. It sounded demonic, but somewhat human as well, with the sound of a clogged throat. Matthew fled into the darkness, and could hear the petrifying sound of their gait close behind him. Matthew could hear what sounded like snapping bones, and the sound of something wet slapping the ground. These humanoid beasts snarled mere feet behind Matthew. It sounded seething and sorrowful simultaneously. Matthew could only imagine what these ravenous animals would do to him if they managed to capture him. The chase and flee carried on for several minutes, which caused Matthew to notice something. Though these creatures were not quite as fast as him, their stamina seemed to be endless. It was as if they had no need for rest, and were driven only by the desire to kill. They did not seem to lose any energy or enthusiasm in their pursuit of Matthew's flesh. It was quite the contrary, in fact, as their vigor only seemed to grow the longer the chase went on. It seemed they viewed Matthew as weak prey that was slowing down by the minute. Sweat poured from the man, as he desperately tried to keep up his speed. Adrenaline from the intense fear of being eaten pumped through his veins. His pulse vibrated all around Matthew's body, as he felt himself become uncomfortably hot. The freaks continued to snarl and spit as their several limbs eagerly clambered off of the path's grassy ground. Matthew realized that he could not keep this pace up forever, and he would eventually tire out. The meadow's pathway made it far too easy for these atrocities to follow Matthew. He knew that he would have to leave the path if he wanted any chance of losing them. At first, his instinct told him to go downhill, though the downward trajectory would give his pursuers more momentum and speed. All they needed to do was get a hold of Matthew, and it would be a gory end for the man. On the contrary, running uphill would quickly deplete whatever energy Matthew had left. He had to make a decision, as his lungs began to burn and cry for respite. As he approached a bend in the path, which would temporarily break the beast's sight line on their meal, Matthew had made his decision. He dug deep within himself and searched for any reserve of energy. He picked up his speed and raced towards the bend. As the curve of the pathway gifted him a temporary cloak from the chasing monsters, Matthew eagerly climbed up the side of the hill. He saw a tree of massive girth and pursued it with haste in his steps. The man wasted no time, and hurled himself behind the large base of the tree. He slammed his back against it, and stood completely motionless. The petrifying sound of the approaching stalker's screams caused a chill to run down his spine. He prayed that the nightmarish animals could not smell him, nor that they saw his movement. As their howls and crackling carcasses grew closer, Matthew's heart rate spiked to absurd level. He discovered just how loudly he had begun to hyperventilate, and quickly sheathed his mouth with his hands. The freaks seemed to come to a complete stop, as the unsettling sound of their snuffling returned. They had obviously picked up on Matthew's scent, and it would only be a matter of time before they discovered his hiding spot. Their unnatural gait could be heard, as it seemed to approach ever closer to Matthew. He desperately tried to calm himself down, but the hyperventilation only increased in its severity. Matthew had never felt such a sense of impotent dread in his life. The sound of dragging limbs approached him, as sweat poured down his red face. Matthew considered making a run for it, but knew his body would surely give out on him. He looked at the steep incline before him, and could feel his body's apprehension. Despite his dire situation, Matthew's body desperately needed time to recuperate from the last 10 or so minutes of vigorous exercise. Matthew closed his eyes and allowed his ears to tune into his surroundings. It sounded like one of the beasts was alarmingly close, whilst the other two were off in the distance. He hoped that the creature in close proximity would lose his scent or attempt its search elsewhere. One of the monstrous creatures bellowed out from some 30 or so feet away, which caused the other two to do the same thing. It was as if they were having some sort of conversation, in a shared dialect. Matthew heard the animal nearest to the tree begin to shift away from him. After a moment, Matthew made the daring decision to peek out from behind his cover. Matthew could see the repulsive being migrating away from his location. He was disgusted by the sight of its loose, sagging flesh that was caked in a pus-like material. The substance dripped off the beast in large green clumps. Its several limbs, several of which that were bent and broken in unnatural directions, dragged and flopped behind it. Teeth and fingers littered its disgrace of a body. It was as if several people had been forcibly jammed into one cursed carcass, and were forced to walk the earth like that. Matthew returned to his concealed shelter and let out a sigh of relief. He crouched down behind the tree and allowed himself to rest for a while. His body was very thankful for this time of repose. After nearly an hour, Matthew felt that his body had regained its strength. He decided to continue his trek upward, to see if he could reach the very top. This would allow him a good vantage point, and help the man figure out his new surroundings. Step after step, the man pushed himself up the steep terrain. Every few minutes, Matthew would pause and listen to his surroundings, being careful not to encounter any more beasts of the night. He looked up to notice a small sliver of light that was beginning to rise above him. The sunrise was coming, and with it a new day. Matthew continued to ascend the blue hillside, with the peak within his sight. As he marched, Matthew watched the cerulean-shaded blades of grass begin to glimmer under the sun's warm embrace. Step after step, the man felt his strength return to him, as his promise to his wife passed through his mind. Though he had no earthly idea where he was or what was going on around him, Matthew would keep his promise. He would rescue his daughter, or die trying. Matthew noticed the brush around him begin to thin, as his altitude increased. He looked forward to an elevated point of view, without a dense forest secluding his vision. With only a few meters separating Matthew from the summit, he galloped his way to the finish line. As the final trees passed him by, Matthew had reached the pinnacle of this steep mound of earth. The man froze in awe, not capable of registering what his eyes saw. Before Matthew was miles of flat land, with less and less of the vegetation populating it the further you looked. It was as if the land grew more dead by the mile. At the furthest point viewable, the land appeared to be devoid of all life, ash in color. Near to his location and beneath the blue meadow, was a long and deep valley that resembled a straight river without any water. This depression in the earth was only a few 100 feet wide, but ran for miles. It eventually ended in the distance, and was replaced with more flat land. Bordering the sides of this valley was more of the same flat land, running parallel for as far as Matthew's eyes could perceive. Though the most compelling characteristic of this land was not what was laid on the ground, but what floated above. Like the asteroids that Matthew could see only a few of in his limited view of the sky from the dense meadow, existed thousands of the very same chunks of space rock. All slowly rotating and basking in the great sun's glory. The blue veins pulsed through them all, glimmering for the entire planet to see. The sky seemed to mirror the health of the land, in that as the ground got darker with distance, so too did the sky. Nearest to Matthew was a clear and healthy atmosphere that grew more sinister as it went along. Until the very end of Matthew's view, way in the distance was nothing but black in the sky. However, the crown jewel of this grandiose canvas laid at the very end of this earth. Where the sky was its blackest, existed an astronomic hole in heavens. It was as if God himself had torn through the sky and left a truly massive gateway for himself to pass through. It very much resembled the void that Matthew had passed through to find himself in this uncanny place. Through this gateway flowed a beam of energy that connected the sky to the earth. Within this beam was an ever-flowing red and purple substance that traveled to the black abyss beneath it. Matthew had never seen something so awe-inspiring and existentially intimidating at the same time. The man felt so immeasurably small and lost. He struggled to grasp the idea that he had somehow found himself stranded on some sort of alien planet. He found the sound of that to be completely ludicrous, though it was the only plausible explanation for what he was witnessing. He was confounded by the momentum in which his life had been turned completely upside down. The deterioration of his family, and the lack of knowing why this was happening to him, filled Matthew with nothing but anguish. He asked himself where he would even begin to search for Anna, if she was even here. Matthew recognized the negative trajectory of his thoughts, and tried to course-correct his mood. Him settling into a defeatist attitude would do his daughter no good. He told himself, "You will find her, she's okay." The deeply hurt man took a moment to calm his thoughts and body. He watched as this vast land before him was clarified further by the distant stars' praise. Matthew's body welcomed the radiant warmth from the sun with open arms. He closed his eyes and enjoyed the comforting glow of heat that cascaded over his entire being. As he basked in the snug glory, Matthew recalled the words of his father from years past. With a new day comes a new opportunity. Matthew missed his father dearly, and could go for his guidance in this arduous moment. His father's inner strength and eternal optimism always inspired Matthew. Though he loved his father, he never believed that he could ever come even close to filling his shoes. Matthew often wondered if his father's passing was the beginning of his downfall, or if it had started long before that. Regardless, he knew that his father would not fall into self-pity and woe. He would rise to the challenge before him, no matter how difficult. The mountain would be climbed, and the ocean would be swam across. There was no burden too large that could not be defeated. Matthew's father would charge towards this obstacle head-on, and so would Matthew. He would find his daughter, and take her home. This new sense of hope grew inside of the father. His daughter's smiling face appeared in his mind, and he mirrored her expression. Though this feeling of positivity was swiftly displaced by the feeling of a sharp object pressed into the flesh of Matthew's back. He opened his eyes and began to turn. Though as he did this, the pressure of the pointy object increased, and burrowed into his back further. Matthew let out a grunt of immense discomfort. The voice of a man spoke out from behind him. "Don't move, or I will put this blade right through you." Not the only one. Approximately 1 hour after Matthew found himself in the odd place, so too did Officer Mike Parker. His eyes shot open, to find himself in a completely foreign region. The young and ambitious officer found himself in the very same meadow as Matthew. All around the man was blue grass, white trees with red leaves, and a sky full of beautiful pulsing asteroids. Officer Parker sat in complete disbelief at the incredibly strange journey he had been taken on. Flashes of being flung through the vast emptiness of space in some sort of translucent transportation vessel. It felt as if he had just undergone some sort of psychedelic trip, though he knew what had just occurred was very real. He looked down at his hands, which were trembling. The battered and bruised officer struggled to his feet, and looked all around. He reacted to his peculiar setting. What the fuck? He spit another wad of blood, and watched it collide with the shimmering blue grass by his feet. Parker wiped the residual blood from his lips with his arm. The murmuring breeze cascaded past his face as he took in his new surroundings. The young man recalled the beating that he had just taken, as his body reminded him. As he rolled his shoulders and neck, he noticed how quiet this place was. That was until the unsettling sound of a foreign roar passed through the meadow. The young man had never heard anything like it, and made it known that he was out of his territory. Parker attempted to pinpoint the direction and relative distance of the sound's origin. Though it came from a respectively distant spot, Parker did not intend to stick around to meet its creator. He swiftly removed himself from the open area that he was currently located in. He headed in the opposite direction of the intimidating howl. Though Parker was completely out of his element, he fell back on his training. Cover and staying off of the radar were integral in this situation. He felt it best to stay hidden and collect information about his surroundings. He had no clue what inhabited these woods, and decided it best to stay clear of their notice. The officer worked his way into the dense brush of the forest, being sure to make as little sound as possible. As Parker worked his way deep into the mysterious forest, he heard several more roars in several varying directions. This caused the man to come to a complete stop, and rethink his strategy. Whatever was making these sounds, they seemed to be all around this meadow. Though they all shared a similar trait, that being that they seemed to be coming from above. The creatures making these noises must have been at a higher elevation. So Parker decided that he'd trek downhill, and see what awaited him at the ending of these woods. Though he had no idea just how long the forest persisted on for, he felt quite confident that his years of physical training would see him through. Some in his personal life may have considered Parker to be overly confident, but the man rarely fell short of his goals. He also always prided himself on his physical ability, and always sought to better his overall performance. Despite never encountering an experience anywhere near to this one, Parker simply viewed it as a challenge. To the young officer, it was nothing more than another hurdle to clear. After clearing through hundreds of feet of brush, Parker eventually found the beginning of a decline in the topography. He carefully began his descent, being sure that his footing was precise. Parker knew that the last thing he wanted in this environment was to injure his legs. A hindered lower body equaled a defenseless man, easy to be picked off. Parker knew that this place was devoid of all the kindness and manners of society. There was no structure, and no enforcement of law in this place. This was the wild, and he was on his own. In the wild, the predators would seek, kill and devour the weak. The prey's power would become their own, and Parker did not intend on becoming prey. As he worked his way downhill, Parker could still hear the occasional howl, though they grew in distance. Parker maintained a respectably quick and consistent pace down the never-ending hill. The white trees with pulsing red leaves passed by the man, as he declined. Though his pace would catch up with Parker, as the dewy grass caused the man to temporarily lose his footing. As his foot made contact with the damp midnight grass, it quickly slipped forward. This paired with the downhill momentum, caused his knee on the other leg to crash into the ground at a resounding speed. After his knee slammed into the moist grass, the energy of the fall rapidly pulled his upper body downward. Parker instinctively shielded his face with his hands, as he violently collided with the hard forest floor. His hands ricocheted back into his face, as the unforgiving ground punished his entire body. The gruesome accident continued to play out, as Parker helplessly tumbled down the malevolent hillside. His cascading body came to a sudden and harsh stop, as it collided with the base of a tree. Chest first, Parker was pummeled by the deep-rooted and strong tree. The poor man simply laid still for quite a long time, as the pain of what had just occurred began to make itself known. The young man's pride was pushed to its limits, as the urge to weep out was overwhelmingly enticing. He instead began to pant, as the agony radiated over him. He analyzed himself, attempting to diagnose the severity of his injuries. The most noticeable to Parker was the immense discomfort coming from his knee, which had vigorously impacted with the hard ground. The next in order would have to be his diaphragm, which was introduced to the tree just a few moments ago. This made it extremely painful to breathe for the young man. The rest of his body was just covered in a relatively manageable amount of pain. Though this violent accident, paired with his very recent assault, was pushing Parker's body to its limits. The man gave himself just a moment to rest and sulk, before trying to pick himself up. He muttered to himself under his breath, "On your feet, soldier." Though Parker was confronted with a sobering reality check the moment he tried to put weight on his leg. His knee screamed at his action, and Parker immediately retracted the leg, allowing it to instead hover above the ground. He braced himself against the tree that had stopped his downward tumble. As he leaned back against it, a debilitating ache emanated from the man's chest cavity. Parker figured that in the best-case scenario, his knee was simply sprained and his chest was severely bruised. The worst-case scenario was that he had suffered a fracture from his fall, in a foreign and potentially hostile environment. Parker gracefully leaned forward off of the tree, and carefully put weight on his knee. Though painful, he would fight through the pain so that he could get off of this treacherous decline. He figured that, so long as he took it slow, he could safely reach the bottom. Officer Parker turned to face the downward slope before him, and could not even see the bottom. All he could see was a dense and endless forest, though every hill has its bottom, but every man his limits. It was time to see which would give in first. As Parker took his first step downhill, his knee managed to hold his weight. Feeling slightly reassured from the test step, Parker began to cautiously continue his twilight hike. The injured man made good use of every tree that came near his trajectory, placing his hands upon them for additional support. All was looking good for the youthful officer, all things considered. Then, as Parker took a step like any other, his radio, which was placed on his utility belt, became unattached. The damaged radio fell and bounced off of the floor below. As soon as it made impact, the radio was activated. It then began to shriek out an alarmingly loud sound, similar to the sound of feedback. The high-pitched squeal filled the mellow and quiet woods. Parker panicked and quickly retrieved the radio from off of the ground. He frantically cranked the volume dial, then turned the radio off completely. Parker then stood completely still, praying that whatever had been howling in the dark earlier did not hear the radio. His prayers were not answered, as the haunting noise of a distant roar met his ears. Then another roar, and another rang out from all around Parker. In each and every direction, a wretched symphony of shrieks played out for Parker's dismay. "Son of a bitch!" The frustrated man shouted out. He began to panic, knowing full well that he could not outrun a turtle in his current state, let alone whatever beasts lurked in the blackness. Then, in the heat of trepidation, inspiration struck the man. He turned the radio back on, as well cranking the volume all the way up. The disorienting ringing resumed, as Parker lobbed the radio back uphill as far as he could. As the scattered howls continued, Parker began down the hill once again. He tried to quicken his pace, but this only worsened the nearly unbearable throbbing in his knee. The veteran grunted through the pain, as he pushed his unwilling body onward. The roars grew closer, as the radio continued to scream above him. Parker glanced over his shoulder and saw nothing, but was certain this would change rather soon. Anxiety pulsed through the man's veins as he painstakingly pressed on. Step after throbbing step, Parker listened as the alien yells closed in around him. He looked down and could his pepper spray and taser had survived all of the chaos. He chose the pepper spray, and decided to keep his other hand free to brace against the approaching trees. He needed all of the support, so that he would not tumble once again. Minute after minute, the desperate man fumbled down the infinite mound. Louder grew the whining, and Parker hoped that the orchestrators of the sounds would go for his bait instead of him. Then his heart sank, as the unbearable screeching of the radio, suddenly fell silent. Then after a brief hush, and blood-curdling howl rang out above Parker. With panic in his eyes, he pushed himself past the point of agony and began to run down the hillside. With each and every step, the man cried out as his body begged him to stop. Parker had been pushed to his limits before, but had never felt so unbelievably helpless in his entire life. His job would put him through such unbearable levels of stress every single day, and yet it did not compare to the overwhelming tension he was experiencing. Then the sound of distant feet behind him sent the man into full-on panic. For only a brief moment, Parker peeked over his shoulder. He saw the shadow of some god-awful thing approaching from only a few hundred feet above him. It awkwardly galloped on all fours in his direction. Parker desperately tried to keep up his pace, but knew deep down that he could not outrun his pursuer. Then, to make matters even worse, the sound of approaching steps emanated from the right of him. Parker looked to his right, to see some horrid beast less than 100 feet from him. It was on a trajectory straight for him, sending Parker's heart into overdrive. Being flanked from both sides, the young man struggled to decide where to navigate his attention. Clenching his pepper spray tight, Parker peeked to his right once again. The mysterious creature was much closer, which revealed its grotesque form to the officer. Its revolting flesh dripped of pus, and its body was covered by abstractly placed limbs and other extremities. Its loose skin bounced with each step, in a revolting manner. Parker felt that his worst nightmares could not create something so deformed and disproportional. The beast's shape made no logical sense, and challenged the mind to even accept its supernatural design. The sounds it made intimidated Parker to his core, as it closed in on the injured man. With a deep and powerful breath, Parker stood his ground. His eyes set on the approaching attacker. Its endless eyes all over its cursed corpse did the very same, as it sprinted towards Parker with the utmost aggression. Parker broke through his fear, and screamed at the foul beast. "Come on, you motherfucker!" He hollered with relentless fury, as he prepared for the fight of his life. Parker could hear the creature coming from above, but knew it was much further away than the one to his right. He tried to not let the thoughts of dismay display themselves, though he knew deep down that he was in a very bad situation. Hyperventilating, the hardened man shouted a primal grunt at the top of his lungs. The despicable monster closed in on Parker, only 10 feet away. Parker then swiftly dispatched his pepper spray with precision, effectively landing it on his target. As the disabling toxin cascaded all over the beast, it shrieked in torment. The creature's trajectory quickly shifted away downhill and away from Parker. The man stood his ground, and watched the fleeing cretin. The disabled took a wide berth from Parker, before turning back towards him a mere 15 feet downhill. A tense stare-down commenced, as Parker and beast locked eyes once again. Parker tried to intimidate the primal abomination, and screamed once again. "You want some more? Come on. I got plenty more for you." Then Parker recalled the approaching monster from above, and quickly shifted his gaze. It stood only mere meters from Parker, in a pre-lunging pose. Parker repeated his previous assault, and filled the upward air with his offensive spray. It reached the high-grounded assailant, and it reacted as such. It violently thrashed about, and retreated up, though only a few feet. Parker then turned back towards the beast downhill from him, to witness it closing in on him. He pointed the pepper spray back towards it, and the creature instinctively stepped back. Parker now had to defend himself on 2 fronts, and felt completely outmatched. His eyes frequently shifted from side to side, as his eager attackers waited for the opportunity to strike. Parker then retrieved the taser from his belt, and pointed it at the higher elevated beast. Parker had managed to create a tense standstill, though he feared they would simply pounce at the same time. It felt crucial that he strike first, before it came to that. He decided that whichever of the creatures charged at him next would be the recipient of his taser's sting. Yet another aspect to this scenario was about to be introduced, as Parker could hear the sound of approaching feet from behind him. The young man did not dare look behind him, and take his eyes off of the immediate threats around beside him. The sound of galloping hands and feet grew closer, and his window to act was closing. A terrifying howl came from whatever approached from Parker's rear, and the two other abominations joined in with their own. This seemed to boost their morale and confidence, as their body language became even more obscene and erratic. They foamed at the mouths, and their many eyes had a look of pure aggression in them. Parker knew the moment was now, or never. As the disgusting animal above him charged forward once again, Parker aimed and shot the prongs of his taser uphill. The prongs managed to dig themselves into the loose and pus-riddled flesh of the beast. Then the device sent 50,000 volts of electricity into the foul creature's nervous system. This event caused a ridiculous violent reaction from the animal, as it vigorously flung itself and twitched about. Parker did not waste any time and turned his attention to his attacker beneath him. As he did, he was shocked to see it had crept up behind him, and stood no more than 5 feet away. Its jaw had become unhinged, as despicable green saliva decorated its repulsive mouth. Parker did not hesitate to once again blast the beast's face with the punishing mist. This second round of spray was much closer and therefore much more potent. The humanoid freak of nature screamed in agony as it fled away from the toxic vapor. Despite his best effort to combat his multiple attackers, Parker made a vital mistake. He had neglected the unseen enemy from his rear. He began to turn around, but was devastated by an unbelievably rough and powerful collision. Without even seeing what had hit him, Parker was flung downhill and slammed into the forest floor with the utmost impact. He rolled for another 10 or so feet, no doubt injuring himself far more than before. Having been in a few car accidents in his life, Parker equated the force and pain he felt in this moment to that. His entire body radiated in a pulsating pain. The battered soul recalled the physical and mental hardships he had fought through in his military career. He knew just how much he could endure, and still keep fighting. As his body's momentum came to a rest, Parker quickly attempted to get back to his feet. Though his body disagreed with his decision, as his arms and legs gave out from underneath him. His body may have been failing him, but no ordeal could break the man mentally. He painstakingly rolled over from his chest onto his back. As he did, Parker was given the view of yet another horrid eyesore of a creature standing before him. But this beast had a man saddled upon its back, wielding a long spear. The man's skin had a purple tint to it, similar to a recently deceased person. His eyes were very much bloodshot, and hard to look at. He wore no shirt, which revealed an upper body covered in tattoos of odd patterns and designs, similar to those of ancient cultures. The man made a clicking sound, and the man-beast he rode then slowly approached Parker. It snarled with stringy green spit connected between its lips. Parker sat still with a fearless and mean expression on his face. The wounded officer sneakily began to load another cartridge into his taser, making sure to do it out of his attacker's sight. He did not take his eyes off of the man, Parker wishing to show his lack of worry, and screamed in the beast's face. "Come on, kill me, you ugly fucker." The man upon the beast did not like this display of confidence, as a look of intense anger appeared upon his face. He made another clicking sound, this one different from the first. His monster roared, before opening its mouth wide and jolted towards the injured man. As the beast's teeth nearly brushed his face, Parker shot another set of prongs from his taser. The serrated darts lunged deep into the creature's gullet and latched onto the back of its throat. The debilitating flow of electricity traveled and fried the abomination from the inside. The flash of the voltage illuminated the inside of its mouth, as its many eyes rolled backwards in pain. The violent attack caused the beast to fling itself backwards, with its rider still aboard. The man screamed as he was flung off of the beast's back. He tumbled down the hill some 15 feet, as did his sickening steed. Parker smiled through his pain, knowing that he did not go down without a fight. The purple man struggled to his feet and retrieved his spear. He began to furiously storm towards the immobile officer. Parker had used his second and last cartridge for his taser, and seemed to misplace his pepper spray whilst falling downhill. As Parker watched the enraged man approach, he thought of his family. His wife and children were waiting at home for him right now, and were probably beginning to worry about him. He thought to himself, "They'll never know what happened to me." As the aggressive man closed in on Parker, he reared back his spear. He was ready to plunge his dagger deep into the officer's flesh. The man screamed his war cry, and Parker hollered right back at him. The pointed tip came lunging down with immense speed, but was deflected by a glancing blow from Parker's police baton. Parker had waited until the very last moment to keep his counter concealed from the striking warrior. As the man looked back at Parker, he was met with a cocky smile plastered on the young man's face. This only increased the fury of the warrior, as he hollered once more. He shifted his grip on the spear to the very bottom. With a step forward, he swung the spear like a baseball bat. Parker raised up his baton to block the impact. The collision caused a loud clinging noise. The power created by the man's swing was far too much for the weakened officer to withstand. His grip on his baton was broken by the force, causing it to fly from Parker's hands. The warrior then approached the defenseless young man, and violently stomped his foot down on Parker's chest. Pinned to the ground of the woods, Parker looked up to see the enraged man hoist his spear upward, with its tip pointed directly at his face. Parker closed his eyes, and pictured his family once again. He waited for the killing blow, hoping that it would be a quick death. As the malevolent combatant prepared to deliver his killing blow, a voice called out from behind him. "Stop!" The voice caused the warrior to cancel his attack. Without taking his eyes off of Parker, he begrudgingly lowered his spear. Parker broke the stare, but knew their conflict was far from over. He peered over at root of this voice, to see a small convoy of men. They all rode their own humanoid beast towards Parker. Slowly they approached, all wielding their own spears. They too had a purple complexion to their skin, which was covered in the same symbolic tattoos. The leader looked upon Parker up and down, then smiled. He sported a white cloth that was tightly wounded and tucked around his head. Protruding from its sides were some exotic feathers of bedazzling colors and shape. Parker's attacker looked at his leader with visible confusion, then spoke. "Let me kill this scum Gastoon, one less mutineer to worry about." Gastoon, the leader continued to analyze Parker, then responded. "This is no mutineer, Dali. He is too clean, must have just arrived." Parker sat motionless, staring at these bizarre-looking people. He wondered what caused these men's deformities, and what the symbols inked across their bodies signified. Gastoon shook his head, then made his decision. "No, we will keep this one alive." Dali's eyes bulged, as his body language became erratic. He looked at his leader with fury. "What? He is too dangerous to be kept alive. Please Gastoon, let me end his life." Gastoon chuckled at Dali's comments, and stared at his subordinate for a moment before responding. "Ah, so it is because he nearly bested you, Dali. Your pride will be your downfall, I promise you." Dali instantly rebutted Gastoon's words with volume in his voice. "He did not come close to besting me, Gastoon. Nobody can do that. He used his tricks, that is all." Gastoon's expression quickly shifted to irritation, as he looked at Dali like an upset father would their son. The look in his eyes caused Dali to relax his aggressive posture and break his eye contact. Gastoon addressed his follower. "You will watch your tongue when you speak to me, boy, or I will cut it out of your mouth." A look of fear filled Dali's face, as he lowered his head in shame. "I apologize for my disrespect." He said the words in a soft tone, like a scolded child. Gastoon maintained his intense stare towards Dali for some time, before continuing. "We will bring this one back to Charnan. You know how he loves his playthings to be tough." Gastoon looked Parker in the eyes. "They're more fun to break that way. And he just loves authority figures. This cop will bring him much glee indeed." With these words, Gastoon clicked his tongue. One of his fellow warriors approached his side, awaiting his command. "Bind him, you will be carrying him back." The warrior obliged his leaders, and unmounted his revolting beast. He then retrieved a large bundle of rope from a satchel attached to the creature's hindquarters. As he reached to grab the officer's arm, Parker sprung his foot into the warrior's knee. This caused it to hyperextend backwards, and the man shrieked in agony. Gastoon gestured his head, and 3 more of his goons unmounted their humanoids. They all surrounded Parker, and pounced on the scrappy young man. Parker managed to land a few punches in the scuffle, but was eventually subdued by the men's joint strength and weight. As they began to bound his hands and legs with rope, Gastoon had an impressed look on his face, and commented, "Yes, Charnan will like this one very much." He then turned his grotesque steed around and departed. As Parker continued to struggle and try to free himself, Dali approached. He wielded his spear, but with the blunt end facing Parker. He looked at the officer with loathsome fire in his eyes, then spoke. "You're gonna wish I got to kill you, after Charnan is done with you, scum." Parker said nothing, but instead opted to spit in Dali's direction. Somehow Dali managed to look even more enraged, as Parker's saliva dripped down his chest. Without hesitation, Dali reared back his spear, and drove the dull end of it straight into Parker's defenseless temple. The violent impact rendered the hard-headed young man unconscious.